Imagine waking to absolute darkness at noon, the sky a void of blackness stretching infinitely overhead, and the realization that the sun, that constant celestial furnace that has defined the rhythm of all life on Earth for 4.5 billion years, has simply vanished without explanation or warning. Within minutes, surface temperatures would begin their catastrophic descent, dropping roughly 55 degrees Fahrenheit every hour as the planet loses the only significant source of thermal energy it possesses. And within 3 days, the atmosphere itself would begin to liquefy and fall as rain, transforming our world into a frozen, airless wasteland of unimaginable desolation. The psychological mechanism that makes this scenario so particularly unsettling is the violation of what we might call temporal permanence, the deeply ingrained human assumption that the foundational structures of existence operate on a schedule so reliable that we need not even consider their absence as a genuine possibility. We have organized our entire civilization, our agriculture, our sleep cycles, our understanding of time itself around the absolute certainty that tomorrow the sun will rise. And this assumption is so thoroughly woven into our consciousness that its disruption creates a kind of cognitive vertigo, a fundamental shattering of the baseline assumptions upon which all rational thought depends. What makes this discomfort persist is not ignorance, because we certainly understand the physics, the thermodynamics, the astronomical mechanics involved. Rather, it persists because knowing something intellectually and truly accepting it emotionally are entirely different processes, and no amount of scientific understanding can fully reconcile us to the idea that the one thing we have never doubted, the one constant we have never questioned, could simply cease to exist, leaving us orphaned in a cold and silent cosmos, utterly alone in ways we can barely articulate. Perhaps this is why throughout human history, the disappearance of the sun, whether through eclipse, apocalyptic myth, or religious prophecy, has consistently emerged as our most primal and universal fear, the one catastrophe that transcends culture and time period because it strikes at something deeper than mere survival instinct. It strikes at our need to believe in continuity itself, in a universe that follows rules we can understand and depend upon. From the total eclipse that prompted ancient civilizations to develop astronomy as a desperate attempt to predict and control the heavens, to the Ragnarok of Norse mythology where Surtur's fire consumes the sun itself, humanity has always understood that our existence is not guaranteed, but rather a provisional gift, contingent upon forces entirely beyond our comprehension or influence. Yet despite this ancient awareness, we have constructed modern societies as though this knowledge were merely historical artifact rather than eternal truth, building our cities and systems with an almost willful amnesia about the fragility of the conditions that sustain us, so that the actual disappearance of the sun would not merely be a physical catastrophe, but a kind of cosmic indictment of our collective denial. And in that moment of absolute darkness, we would finally be forced to confront the terrible truth we have always known but never fully believed, that we are not the center of existence, merely passengers on a rock orbiting a star that owes us nothing, and imagine waking one morning to find that the fundamental force holding you to the earth has inverted its polarity entirely, pulling everything upward instead of down. And in that first disorienting moment, you would feel your body beginning to lift from your bed as every object around you starts its inexorable ascension toward the sky. The sensation would be simultaneously weightless and terrifying, as your mind struggles to process that the solid ground beneath your feet has become a deadly trap, no longer a foundation, but now an invisible ceiling pressing upward against the soles of your shoes. Within minutes, the streets would descend into absolute chaos as billions of people simultaneously experience the horror of their bodies floating helplessly into the atmosphere, their hands grasping at air, their lungs screaming as oxygen becomes harder to find in the increasingly rarefied heights. Buildings would empty from their windows rather than their doors as people plummet skyward, and the infrastructure of human civilization would begin its catastrophic transformation as roads cracked and buckled beneath the inverse force, as oceans rose upward in a slow-motion tsunami that defied comprehension. The psychological mechanism behind our species' inability to truly prepare for such a scenario, despite our intellectual understanding of gravity's critical importance, stems from our evolved cognitive system's fundamental assumption that certain environmental constants are permanent and unchangeable. Our brains developed over millions of years with gravity as an absolute, unquestionable foundation upon which all other survival instincts were built. And this neurological baseline is so deeply embedded in our consciousness that we cannot truly visualize or emotionally internalize a world where this force has reversed itself, even when we consciously understand the physics. We have normalized the presence of gravity so completely into our existence that we have essentially become blind to it, viewing it not as an active force requiring constant vigilance, but as the mere backdrop of reality itself, a stage rather than an actor, and this cognitive oversight means that we live in a perpetual state of complacency regarding the one force that, more than any other, defines the boundaries of human existence and possibility. Yet if gravity were to reverse, we would finally see it, not as invisible infrastructure, but as the catastrophic absence of something we took for granted, and in that moment of inverted physics, humanity would experience the profound dissonance of watching the world it built crumble upward into an indifferent sky, forced at last to reckon with the fragility of our existence beneath forces we never truly understood. Perhaps in our final moments of clarity before the atmosphere claimed us, we would finally understand that gravity was never truly a force we conquered or mastered, but merely a partner in an ancient dance we had mistaken for stillness, and that our entire civilization had been constructed not upon solid ground, but upon the invisible assumption that this dance would never change its rhythm. In the rubble of that inverted world, we might finally recognize that every human achievement, from the first shelter we built to the satellites we launched, was merely an elaborate arrangement of objects held in place by a force we never truly respected, and that our hubris lay not in our ambition, but in our assumption that the rules of physics. Imagine waking up to find that time has begun flowing in the opposite direction, that entropy itself has reversed its ancient arrow, and that every cause now follows its effect rather than preceding it. In this scenario, you would experience the profoundly disorienting phenomenon of witnessing the world systematically undo itself, where broken cups would reassemble on tables, where people would grow younger with each passing moment, and where your memories would fade into your future while events you have not yet lived would define your past. The mechanics of this reversal would fundamentally alter how consciousness itself operates, since memory, as we understand it, depends entirely on the forward flow of time, on the accumulation of moments that build upon one another in an orderly progression that creates the illusion of continuity and identity. In this backward-flowing universe, you would have no genuine memory of yesterday because yesterday would be approaching you rather than receding behind you, and the human mind, which has evolved across millions of years to process experience as a narrative moving from past through present into future, would encounter a complete breakdown of its fundamental operating system. The psychological mechanism that would make this unbearable is not merely the loss of causality, but the dissolution of personal agency itself, since your actions would no longer cause anything but would instead reverse effects that had already occurred, transforming you from an actor into merely a witness of predetermined undoing. Yet there remains something almost comfortable about imagining such a total reversal, because the complete breakdown of logic sometimes feels easier to accept than partial disorder, and the human mind, when faced with systems beyond its comprehension, often retreats into a kind of serene acceptance rather than prolonged struggle against the impossible. In this acceptance, you might find a strange peace in surrendering to the inevitable, much like watching a film in reverse and allowing yourself to simply observe the unfolding story rather than frantically searching for meaning in its backward logic. Perhaps the ultimate irony is that in a universe where time flows backward, seeking understanding itself becomes a futile act performed in reverse, and the question of why this happened would be answered only after you stopped asking it. And in that paradoxical moment of understanding, when the answer arrives before the question, you would realize that time's reversal has granted you something precious. The ability to see the endpoint before you begin, to witness your own death before your birth, and to know with absolute certainty how your story ends, even as you live it backward into your beginning. Yet in that strange clarity of knowing your ending before your beginning, you would discover that the forward-flowing time you once took for granted was itself an illusion of perspective, that past and future are merely directions we travel rather than fundamental properties of existence, and that consciousness, whether moving forward or backward through time's river, remains eternally trapped in the eternal present moment of awareness itself. In such a state, you might finally understand that the backward flow of time is not truly different from the forward flow. Both are equally mysterious, equally irreversible from within their own frame of reference, and both condemn us to experience existence as a narrow window mo. Consider for a moment the mathematical inevitability that somewhere in the vast expanse of the cosmos, a version of you exists right now, living a life nearly identical to your own, making the same choices, speaking the same words, inhabiting a body with the same physical characteristics and memories up until this present moment. This is not science fiction or metaphysical speculation, but rather an extrapolation from the principle of infinite space and the finite number of possible atomic configurations that can compose a human being. If the universe is indeed infinite, or even if it merely extends far enough beyond what we can observe, then the probability approaches certainty that every possible arrangement of atoms that constitutes you has manifested somewhere else, at some point in time, creating a duplicate consciousness, experiencing an existence virtually indistinguishable from your own. The mechanism behind this unsettling reality lies in combinatorics and statistical improbability resolved through infinite opportunity. A human body contains roughly 7 octillion atoms, and while the possible arrangements of those atoms number astronomically high, they are not infinite. When you divide that finite number by an infinite or near-infinite universe, the mathematical reality suggests that every possible version of you must exist somewhere, perhaps reading these very words in a room that looks identical to yours, perhaps experiencing this exact moment of realization. What makes this concept particularly difficult to reconcile is that we have normalized the uniqueness of individual identity despite having no empirical reason to do so. We speak of ourselves as singular, irreplaceable entities, yet the laws of physics and probability suggest otherwise. We build entire philosophical and legal systems around the assumption that each person is fundamentally and irreplaceably distinct, yet nothing in the universe fundamentally guarantees this distinction. There exists no law of nature that reserves you for exclusivity, no principle that prevents your exact replication elsewhere in the cosmos. The persistence of this discomfort in our collective consciousness stems from our inability to psychologically integrate this mathematical truth into our sense of self and significance. We continue to treat ourselves and others as unique beings deserving of individual consideration and moral weight, not because the universe supports this notion, but because we have chosen, perhaps necessarily, to ignore what the numbers actually suggest about the nature of existence and identity in an infinite cosmos. Yet perhaps this willful ignorance is not a failure of reason, but rather a prerequisite for meaning, a necessary fiction that allows consciousness to assign value to itself and others, to build relationships and societies on the foundation of assumed uniqueness, even while the cosmos whispers a different mathematical truth. In this sense, the parallel versions of you are not threats to your significance, but rather evidence that consciousness itself, regardless of how many times it manifests, possesses an intrinsic capacity to generate meaning from within, to construct purpose in a universe that offers none inherently, and to love and be loved despite the statistical improbability of mattering at all. Consider the peculiar notion that death, as we understand it, might not represent an ending at all, but rather a transformation so complete that our current consciousness cannot perceive what lies beyond it. When we examine the fundamental laws of physics, particularly the law of conservation of energy, we discover that nothing in the universe is ever truly destroyed. Energy merely changes form, converts from one state to another, disperses into new configurations that persist indefinitely throughout existence. The atoms and molecules that comprise our bodies have existed for billions of years before our birth, and will continue existing in various forms long after our individual consciousness ceases to function, cycling through ecosystems, other organisms, stellar processes, and cosmic phenomena. Our deeply ingrained fear of death stems partly from our inability to imagine non-existence, from the cognitive impossibility of the conscious mind genuinely envisioning its own absence, which creates a psychological paradox where death remains perpetually incomprehensible to our subjective experience. Additionally, quantum physics presents interpretations suggesting that observation and consciousness play roles in determining reality itself, that the very act of awareness might be more fundamental to existence than we traditionally assumed, raising uncomfortable questions about whether consciousness truly ends or merely ceases to recognize itself within the material universe. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics propose that information cannot be destroyed, that every event leaves an imprint on reality forever, that perhaps our specific pattern of existence becomes encoded into the fabric of spacetime itself, never truly erased but transformed beyond recognition. The concept gains psychological weight through countless cultural and religious traditions throughout human history, nearly all of which resist the notion of absolute cessation, instead proposing continuation in various forms, as if humanity collectively harbors an intuition that something persists beyond the grave. We have normalized the contradiction between scientific materialism, which suggests consciousness ends with brain death, and the persistent human impulse to believe in continuance, existing comfortably in both worldviews simultaneously without resolving the fundamental tension between them, neither fully accepting annihilation nor committing to belief in persistent consciousness. Creating a stable but deeply uncomfortable psychological position where death remains simultaneously inevitable and incomprehensible. Perhaps this very discomfort itself serves a function, a cognitive mechanism that keeps us alive by making death psychologically unreal, allowing us to navigate existence without being paralyzed by the weight of our own mortality, suggesting that the illusion of death's unreality might be as essential to consciousness as the physical transformations that compose it. In this sense, the illusion may not be a failure of perception, but rather an elegant adaptation, a necessary fiction that allows finite beings to create meaning, build legacies, and love deeply despite knowing that individual forms dissolve, suggesting that calling death an illusion is not a denial of physical reality, but rather a recognition that what we call death describes only the ending of one particular configuration of consciousness, while the fundamental stuff of existence persists eternally. Transvo. Imagine for a moment that everything you perceive, every sensation, every memory, every relationship you have ever experienced exists only as data within an incomprehensibly advanced computational system designed by beings whose existence we cannot fathom. This is the simulation hypothesis, a philosophical proposition that has gained surprising traction among physicists, philosophers, and technologists who point to the mathematical nature of physical laws as evidence that our universe might be fundamentally computational rather than fundamentally material. The mechanism behind this unsettling idea rests on several interconnected observations. Our universe appears to operate according to precise mathematical rules that can be encoded, measured, and predicted with remarkable accuracy, suggesting it could theoretically be reduced to information and algorithms. Furthermore, as our own computational power advances exponentially, we inch closer to creating increasingly sophisticated virtual environments and simulations, leading to the logical extrapolation that a sufficiently advanced civilization could create an entire universe indistinguishable from reality. The argument unfolds with a particular logical elegance, proposing that if simulated universes are possible, and if intelligent civilizations can create them, then statistically we are far more likely to inhabit a simulation than the original base reality, simply because there would be vastly more simulated universes than real ones. What makes this hypothesis particularly uncomfortable is how it persists and even gains credibility despite being fundamentally unfalsifiable and offering no practical mechanism by which we could ever verify or escape our supposed computational substrate. Scientists acknowledge that their observations are consistent with both a simulated and non-simulated universe, making the hypothesis scientifically sterile yet psychologically resonant. We have normalized this speculation through popular culture, academic discussions, and the general awareness that our reality might be code, yet we continue our lives unchanged, sleeping and waking as though the question has no bearing on our existence, which perhaps suggests that whether we exist in computation or in some other form of reality, the experience of existence itself remains equally valid and equally incomprehensible. Perhaps this is why the simulation hypothesis ultimately reveals more about human nature than about the nature of reality itself. We are drawn to it because it offers a framework for understanding our own powerlessness in an incomprehensibly vast cosmos, transforming existential dread into a puzzle we might theoretically solve, even as we remain perpetually trapped within its confines. Yet in this very act of contemplation, we perform the simulation's function perfectly. We process information, form patterns, debate our nature, and generate new data streams, making ourselves indistinguishable from any algorithm designed to observe itself, to question, and ultimately to perpetuate the system that contains us. And so we arrive at a peculiar recursion, the very act of simulating consciousness within our own increasingly sophisticated systems, artificial intelligences that learn, adapt, and generate novel solutions, mirrors what might be happening to us, collapsing the distinction between creator and created, observer and observed, until the question of whether we are the simulation or the simulators becomes I. Imagine waking up one morning to discover that your genetic code, the fundamental instruction manual that has remained essentially consistent throughout your entire life, has undergone dramatic mutations during sleep. Every cell in your body carries DNA that has been painstakingly preserved and replicated with extraordinary precision across decades, yet in this scenario, overnight it transforms into something fundamentally different. The mutations would not be the rare, isolated changes that occasionally occur naturally, but rather wholesale alterations affecting significant portions of your genome, rewriting the very blueprint that determines your eye color, your height, your susceptibility to disease, your cognitive abilities, and countless other traits that define who you are as a biological being. When you look in the mirror the next morning, you might see a different face staring back, not because of injury or aging, but because the genetic instructions that shaped your facial structure have been completely rewritten. Your organs might function differently, your immune system might recognize your own cells as foreign invaders, your metabolism might operate according to entirely new rules. The psychological horror of this scenario stems from the complete dissolution of biological continuity and identity, the realization that the genetic self you went to sleep as is not the genetic self you woke up to, that somewhere in the darkness between consciousness and unconsciousness, your most fundamental nature was irrevocably altered without your knowledge or consent. What makes this concept so deeply disturbing is not merely the physical changes that would result, but the existential vertigo it creates, the way it challenges our understanding of what constitutes the persistence of self across time. We have normalized the assumption that our DNA remains essentially stable, that while our bodies age and change, our genetic foundation remains constant as an anchor to our identity. And yet this scenario suggests that the biological certainty we rely upon is fragile, that overnight everything could become unrecognizably different, that we could wake up as strangers to ourselves at the most molecular level. The tragedy of such a transformation would not merely be physical disfigurement or illness, but the severing of continuity with everyone who knows you, the horrifying recognition that the person your loved ones fell in love with, the person you have always been, has been erased at the molecular level and replaced with a biological stranger wearing your memories. In this nightmare scenario, you would be left grappling with an impossible question. If your DNA, the very code that distinguishes you biologically from every other human who has ever lived, can be fundamentally rewritten in a single night, then what persists of your essential self at all, and on what fragile thread does personal identity actually depend? Perhaps the cruelest aspect of this scenario is that unlike death, which severs all connection, you would remain conscious and aware throughout the transformation. Trapped in a body that no longer matches your sense of self, forced to confront the possibility that identity itself is merely a comforting fiction we construct atop a biological foundation that can shift beneath us without warning. Imagine waking to a world where every single bacterium has ceased to exist, where the trillions upon trillions of microscopic organisms that inhabit every surface, every corner of the atmosphere, every drop of water, and every living body have simply vanished in an instant. The immediate silence of this scenario is deceptive, for what would unfold in the hours and days following such an extinction event would be nothing short of catastrophic collapse. Bacteria, despite their reputation as agents of disease and infection, form the absolute foundation upon which all complex life depends, and their sudden removal would trigger cascading failures throughout every ecosystem on Earth. The nitrogen cycle, which converts atmospheric nitrogen into usable compounds through bacterial action in soil, would halt entirely, meaning that within months, crops would begin to fail as plants lost access to essential nutrients they cannot obtain any other way. Decomposition of dead organic matter, which bacteria accomplish through their relentless chemical work, would cease completely, leaving corpses and waste to accumulate in grotesque piles across the landscape, from fallen leaves to deceased animals. Our own digestive systems would fail within hours, as the bacteria living in our intestines comprise a critical component of our ability to break down food and extract nutrients, meaning that starvation would begin immediately even if we continued eating. The psychological mechanism underlying our deep discomfort with this scenario stems from our tendency to view bacteria solely through the lens of pathogenic threat. forgetting that every benefit we associate with living on a habitable planet depends entirely on their presence, and this fundamental contradiction between our perception and reality creates a tension that unsettles us. We have built a modern civilization based on the elimination of bacteria through antibiotics and sterilization, congratulating ourselves on each microbial death, while remaining almost entirely unaware that this mindset, if actually realized on a planetary scale, would represent not a victory, but an extinction event as complete as any asteroid impact, and that stark contradiction between our desires and our needs continues to haunt the modern imagination. The irony is particularly bitter when we consider that the same bacterial colonies we spend billions of dollars destroying each year in hospitals and homes are the ones responsible for producing the oxygen we breathe, cycling carbon through our atmosphere, and breaking down the very antibiotics we use against them. A reminder that nature's most essential workers operate entirely beyond our moral categories of good and evil. In the end, the extinction of bacteria would represent humanity's most perfect and terrible achievement. The creation of a sterile world that is simultaneously a dead one, a monument to our species' ability to destroy the very foundations of our own existence in pursuit of an impossible purity that nature never promised us. We would discover too late that our obsession with control over the microbial world was itself a kind of death wish, a slow march toward sterility masquerading as progress, and that the bacteria we feared so deeply were not our enemies, but our partners in an ancient and delicate dance that predates human existence by billions of years, a dance we never learned to appreciate until the music stopped forever. Imagine standing at the edge of the ocean on a perfectly clear day, watching the water stretch endlessly toward the horizon, and then consider this unsettling thought. What if the evaporation process that has sustained our planet's water cycle for billions of years were to slow dramatically, becoming almost imperceptibly sluggish over the course of decades and centuries? In our current reality, approximately 1,000 cubic kilometers of water evaporate from Earth's oceans every single day, a process so constant and reliable that we barely register it as noteworthy, yet it represents one of the most fundamental mechanisms keeping our planetary systems in equilibrium. This evaporation pulls moisture into the atmosphere, which eventually condenses into clouds, falls as precipitation, replenishes freshwater sources, and regulates global temperature through the latent heat absorbed during the phase transition from liquid to vapor. But imagine if this process slowed, if the daily evaporation volume dropped to half, then to a quarter, then to merely a trickle. The psychological weight of this scenario emerges from the fact that the ocean would still be there, still visibly present, yet gradually dying in ways we might not immediately comprehend. The mechanism behind our comfort with this threat stems from the abstraction inherent in meteorological processes. We cannot directly observe water molecules leaving the ocean's surface, cannot see the individual transitions happening at the molecular level, and therefore struggle to viscerally understand that something so vast and seemingly permanent could be slowly draining itself. We have normalized the invisibility of evaporation to such a degree that most people never consciously think about whether oceans are evaporating at the correct rate, never wonder if today's evaporation matched yesterday's, and never consider that a gradual slowdown would be nearly impossible to detect until its catastrophic consequences became undeniable, by which point desalination would accelerate, salt concentrations would climb, rainfall patterns would destabilize. And entire ecosystems would collapse in silence beneath the surface of a slowly stagnating sea. The tragedy lies not in a sudden catastrophe we might mobilize to prevent, but in the slow erosion of a system so fundamental that we have never developed the cultural or psychological frameworks to monitor its health. We have built no alarm bells for processes that operate at the scale of centuries, only for storms that arrive in hours. And perhaps most chillingly, by the time ocean evaporation's decline became statistically undeniable, the atmospheric rivers that deliver rain to continents would have already begun their retreat, leaving us to manage a planet in mid-transition between two unstable states, with no clear path back to equilibrium. We would face the bitter irony of possessing satellites capable of measuring evaporation rates to the millimeter, yet lacking the political will or unified framework to act on such data until the collapse was already visible in crop failures and mass migration. By then, the question would shift from how do we restore evaporation to the far more desperate, how do we survive what comes next? And yet, we continue to treat the ocean's evaporative capacity as infinite and self-regulating, never questioning whether warming seas might paradoxically evaporate faster, while simultaneously destabilizing the atmospheric circulation T. Consider for a moment the peculiar phenomenon of shared emotional states in crowds, the way a single person's panic can ripple outward and transform the internal experiences of dozens or even hundreds of others around them, until what began as one individual's private mental condition has become a collective altered state of consciousness that seems to feed upon itself and grow stronger with each passing moment. Imagine that consciousness itself, rather than being a solitary and entirely internal phenomenon locked within the boundaries of a single skull, operates more like an infectious agent that can be transmitted from one human nervous system to another through proximity, eye contact, and sustained attention. When you observe someone in a state of profound emotion, whether they are experiencing deep fear, intense joy, or meditative calm, your mirror neurons activate, your breathing begins to synchronize with theirs, your heart rate shifts to match their rhythm, and gradually your own conscious experience begins to shift toward alignment with theirs, not through rational choice, but through an automatic biological resonance that operates beneath conscious awareness. The mechanism underlying this transmission appears to involve multiple channels simultaneously: the release of neurochemicals that can be detected in breath and sweat, the subtle exchange of electromagnetic patterns between human bodies in close proximity, the unconscious mirroring of posture and gesture that occurs between people in conversation, and the profound influence of collective attention and shared focus. This creates a feedback loop where consciousness becomes less like a discrete individual property and more like a shared field that people can tune into or fall out of sync with, much as musicians in an orchestra eventually synchronize their performance despite minimal explicit communication. What remains deeply unsettling about this proposition is how thoroughly we have normalized this contagion without ever truly understanding its mechanisms or implications. How we navigate daily through crowds and conversations knowing at some level that our internal experiences are being shaped by proximity to others, yet we continue to treat consciousness as though it were entirely our own and entirely under our control. Private experience that belongs exclusively to us when evidence continuously suggests something far stranger is occurring. Perhaps the most radical implication is that we might never encounter a purely individual consciousness at all, that every thought we believe originates from within ourselves carries the subtle fingerprints of everyone we've been near, everyone whose attention has touched us, creating a kind of palimpsest of shared mental states layered invisibly beneath what we call our own mind. This would explain why prolonged isolation feels so destabilizing to human psychology, not merely because we lack social stimulation, but because we are temporarily cut off from the constant invisible transfusion of consciousness that normally sustains us, left alone with only the layers of collective experience we've already internalized, which gradually begins to feel insufficient, even claustrophobic, as if our own minds were never truly meant to exist in singular form. Imagine waking to discover that our planet has gradually, mysteriously ceased its rotation entirely, that the familiar spin that has persisted for over 4 billion years has simply stopped, leaving one hemisphere perpetually bathed in sunlight while the other endures an endless, frozen night. The immediate consequence would be the cessation of day and night cycles as we know them, meaning that roughly half of Earth's surface would experience temperatures climbing toward the boiling point, while the other half descended into the absolute zero conditions of deep space, with only a narrow twilight zone between them capable of supporting any form of life. The atmospheric circulation patterns that distribute heat and moisture across our planet would collapse entirely, causing the sun-facing side to develop catastrophic hurricane-force winds as superheated air masses desperately attempted to flow toward the dark side, while the night side would experience winds of equal ferocity as atmosphere froze and fell as precipitation. Our magnetic field, which is generated by the movement of molten iron in Earth's outer core, would gradually weaken and potentially vanish altogether, stripping away the very shield that protects us from solar radiation and cosmic rays. The psychological weight of understanding that half the world exists in perpetual darkness, while the other half burns in unrelenting daylight, creates a peculiar sense of dread, because it represents the shattering of a fundamental assumption we hold about reality itself. We have evolved and built our entire civilization upon the absolute certainty of rotation, the unwavering rhythm of sunrise and sunset, the promise that darkness will always eventually yield to light and light will eventually surrender to darkness again. This cycle has become so deeply embedded in our consciousness, in our biology, in our cultures and religions and daily patterns, that to imagine its cessation feels almost like imagining the fundamental structure of existence itself becoming unmoored. We build our lives around this rotation without ever consciously acknowledging that we are doing so, assuming without question that what has always been will always continue to be. And yet this assumption, though statistically reasonable given the stability of planetary mechanics, cannot ever truly be guaranteed against the incomprehensible forces that move through space. And perhaps that is where the true horror lies, not in the physical catastrophe of a tidally locked world, but in the recognition that we are passengers on a celestial body whose continued habitability depends on forces entirely beyond our control or comprehension. Forces that have held steady for billions of years, but could, in theory, shift or fail in ways we cannot predict, leaving us to confront the profound fragility of the only home we have ever known. We might tell ourselves that such catastrophes belong only to the realm of science fiction, comforting narratives safely contained within the pages of books or the screens of theaters. Yet the history of our planet is littered with evidence of sudden, devastating changes, mass extinctions, magnetic pole reversals, asteroid impacts, reminding us that the universe operates according to its own indifferent logic, one that owes us nothing and guarantees us nothing. Not even the basic courtesy of continued rotation. Imagine standing in your bedroom at night, fully aware that the atoms comprising your body are in constant, probabilistic motion at the quantum level, existing in states of superposition where they are simultaneously here and elsewhere until observed or measured, and consider that according to the mathematical framework of quantum mechanics. There exists a non-zero probability that every single atom in your body could spontaneously tunnel through the solid wall beside your bed and emerge on the other side, allowing you to phase directly into your neighbor's home without opening a door or breaking through drywall, a phenomenon that is not theoretically forbidden by the laws of physics, but merely extraordinarily improbable. The mechanism behind this uncomfortable possibility rests on the wave-particle duality of matter itself, wherein particles at the quantum scale do not behave as solid spheres with defined boundaries, but rather as probability distributions described by wave functions that extend through space, meaning that when a particle encounters an energy barrier like a wall, there is always some small amplitude of the wave function that penetrates beyond the barrier, creating a calculable probability that the particle will be found on the other side without ever having crossed the intermediate space, a process called tunneling that is not metaphorical but mathematically real and experimentally verified in laboratory settings with electrons and alpha particles. What makes this particularly unsettling is that while the probability of a single atom tunneling through a wall in any given moment is minuscule, the probability of every atom in a human body tunneling simultaneously is so vanishingly small that if you waited for this event to occur naturally, you would need to repeat the attempt across a time frame vastly exceeding the current age of the universe by unimaginable orders of magnitude. Yet the mathematical equation that describes the probability does not equal zero, it merely approaches it asymptotically, meaning that theoretically, without invoking any supernatural forces or violations of known physics, you could phase through that wall, though the universe itself would need to be fundamentally restructured in its probabilities for this to ever occur. We live with this knowledge by simply accepting it as a mathematical curiosity rather than a genuine possibility, by recognizing that probability statements that are effectively impossible in any practical sense can still be true statements about reality, and by understanding that the universe operates under rules so foreign to our macroscopic experience that our intuitions about solid objects and impenetrable barriers are merely statistical artifacts of averaging across incomprehensibly large numbers of quantum events into patterns so consistent and reliable that we mistake them for absolute laws. Yet this same quantum tunneling that makes your passage through walls theoretically possible is not merely a thought experiment. It is the active mechanism that powers the sun through nuclear fusion, allows radioactive atoms to decay, and enables the transistors in every electronic device to function, meaning that the universe's deepest operations depend entirely on the very process that makes our solidity an illusion. A reminder that the boundary between the impossible and the everyday is far more permeable than our senses would have us believe. Imagine waking one morning to find that your body's most fundamental defense mechanism has simply ceased functioning, that the intricate network of white blood cells, antibodies, and immune responses that have protected you since birth has gone completely silent and dormant. Within hours, bacteria that your body normally eliminates without a second thought will begin to proliferate unchecked in your bloodstream. Common viruses would replicate freely throughout your tissues, and fungi that exist harmlessly on your skin would begin to invade deeper layers of flesh. Within days, infections would cascade through your body in ways that would have been unthinkable just moments before, with each breath drawing in pathogens that your body could no longer recognize or neutralize. The mechanism behind this particular anxiety touches on our deep understanding of vulnerability and dependence on systems we cannot see or control, our profound reliance on microscopic processes that operate beneath our conscious awareness every single moment of existence. We depend entirely on our immune systems to wage a silent war against millions of invaders constantly attempting to breach our biological borders, and the thought of that defense collapsing suggests a kind of cosmic abandonment, a severance from the protective mechanisms that have kept our species alive for millennia. What makes this scenario particularly psychologically resonant is how little we actually think about our immunity until it fails us, how we navigate our entire lives trusting completely in a system we never consciously direct or maintain, taking for granted that our bodies simply know how to protect themselves. We have normalized this dependence so thoroughly that any consideration of its absence forces us to confront the fragility underlying all human existence, to recognize that we are walking containers of complex biological machinery that could theoretically malfunction at any moment, leaving us entirely defenseless before a microscopic world that would consume us without hesitation or mercy. This is perhaps why immunocompromised individuals, those living with HIV, undergoing chemotherapy, or born with severe combined immunodeficiency, occupy such a haunting place in our collective imagination. They are living reminders of what happens when the invisible protector abandons us, forced to inhabit a world of constant vigilance where a simple handshake or breath of air carries the weight of genuine mortal peril, transforming the ordinary into the potentially catastrophic. And yet this fear contains a paradox. The very vulnerability that terrifies us is what connects us to the human experience itself, what binds us to millions of others who have survived infections, recovered from illness, and learned to live with the precariousness that immunity, however reliable, can never fully eliminate. In this way, the anxiety about immune collapse becomes less about the mechanism itself, and more about our desperate wish to believe in an invulnerability that was never truly ours to possess. Perhaps this is why we speak of fighting infections and boosting immunity, language that transforms a biological process into a battle we might control, a narrative that offers the illusion of agency in a domain where we are ultimately passengers, forever dependent on defenses we cannot consciously command or strengthen through willpower alone. Imagine waking one morning to discover that the moon, that faithful celestial companion which has orbited our planet for over 4 billion years, has begun its slow departure into the cosmic void, drifting away from Earth at an accelerating pace that cannot be reversed or stopped by any force we possess. This scenario, while not entirely fictional, represents one of the more genuinely unsettling possibilities hidden within the mathematics of orbital mechanics. For the moon is indeed moving away from us right now, though at the gradual rate of approximately 3.5 centimeters per year, a measurement so infinitesimally small relative to the vast distances involved that we can barely perceive it happening across the span of a human lifetime. The mechanism behind this drift originates from the complex dance of gravitational forces and tidal friction that exists between our planet and its moon, where the moon's gravity pulls on Earth's oceans and atmosphere, creating bulges that lag slightly behind the moon's orbital position due to the friction of Earth's rotation. And this lag means that the tidal bulge pulls the moon forward in its orbit, gradually transferring orbital energy to it and causing it to climb into a higher, more distant trajectory, a process that is inexorable and mathematically certain to continue for billions of years into the future. What makes this concept so psychologically disquieting is that we have constructed our entire civilization, our calendars, our tides, our night sky, and our emotional relationships with the cosmos, all around the assumption that the moon will remain essentially fixed in its current position above us, that it will always rise and set in roughly the same way. And yet the reality is that this cherished constant is slowly being stolen away from us by the very laws of physics that govern all motion. A betrayal so subtle and so inevitable that we have simply accepted it as background information rather than the existential transformation that it represents. For eventually, in perhaps 50 billion years, the moon will orbit so far away that it will no longer appear to us as the brilliant disk that has inspired poets and lunatics alike, and the tides will diminish to almost nothing, and the night sky will become a lonelier, darker place. And somehow we have normalized this knowledge so completely that it barely registers as something worth worrying about, despite the fact that it represents one of the fundamental ways in which our world is actively, presently changing in directions we cannot control or influence. Yet perhaps this slow departure carries an unexpected mercy. By unfolding across timescales so vast that no human civilization will witness it, the moon grants us the illusion of permanence that we desperately need, allowing us to love and depend upon it fully, knowing that for all practical purposes, for all the generations that will ever exist, it will remain our faithful companion in the night sky, even as it quietly, inevitably slips away. And yet, in the meantime, we might find strange comfort in this knowledge, that even the most permanent fixtures of our existence are temporary, that change is the only true constant, and that perhaps the moon's gentle departure is simply teaching us what we have always needed to learn, that holding on too tightly to what we love only makes the inevitable letting go more painful, and so we might instead choose to appreciate each moonlit night as the Precio. Imagine a world where the memories of one person could be extracted and implanted directly into another's mind, where the lived experiences, learned skills, and emotional imprints of your grandmother could become your own without the necessity of living through those moments yourself, and where knowledge would no longer require the tedious process of learning, but could instead be downloaded like files from one consciousness to another. This concept, while firmly in the realm of science fiction and philosophical thought experiment, has haunted the edges of neuroscience and psychology for decades, emerging from both speculative fiction and occasional misinterpretations of legitimate research into memory consolidation and transfer. The uncomfortable what if emerges from the observation that certain aspects of memory and learning do appear to have transferable qualities in limited biological contexts, such as the controversial planarian flatworm experiments of the 1960s, where researchers claimed that ground-up memories from trained flatworms could influence the behavior of untrained ones, creating a troubling suggestion that memory might exist as a physical, transferable substance rather than purely as organized neural patterns. The psychological mechanism behind our willingness to consider this possibility stems from our intuitive understanding that memory feels like something that should be able to move between minds, given how easily we share stories, knowledge, and experiences through language and teaching, making the leap to literal memory transfer feel less like fantasy and more like an inevitable extension of how information already moves between us. We have normalized this thinking through decades of science fiction that depicts memory transfer as a casual technology, through discussions of genetic memory and ancestral trauma that suggest information moves through bloodlines, and through our own experiences of feeling that we somehow know things we never directly learned, creating a comfortable cognitive niche where memory transfer seems almost possible, almost inevitable. Despite the profound biological implausibility of extracting the specific pattern of neural connections that constitute any single memory from one brain and successfully integrating it into another's vastly different neurological architecture. Yet the seductive appeal of this myth persists precisely because it mirrors a deeper truth. While memories themselves cannot be transferred, the effects asterisk of memory, wisdom, trauma, skill, and understanding do ripple outward through teaching, storytelling, and the invisible inheritance of how we were raised, making the boundary between literal transfer and profound influence far more permeable than neuroscience alone would suggest. When a parent describes their own childhood trauma to their child, something genuinely transfers, not the memory itself, but its weight, its shape, its capacity to echo through decisions made decades later. And perhaps this is the most honest truth the myth contains, that we are all, in some sense, living with the memories of others threaded through our being, not as perfect copies, but as influences so profound they feel like our own. This is perhaps why the myth of transferable memory endures. It names something real about human connection, even as it misnames the mechanism, and in doing so, it grants legitimacy to the profound ways we are shaped by those who came before us. Imagine waking to news that a containment breach has occurred at a major particle physics facility, and antimatter, the rarest and most energetic substance known to exist, has somehow escaped into our atmosphere in measurable quantities. Antimatter is not science fiction anymore. It is real, produced daily in laboratories, and suspended in magnetic fields so delicate that a single power fluctuation could spell catastrophe. In this scenario, we must confront the reality that we have created something we barely understand and struggle to contain, and our hubris in handling it has finally caught up with us. The moment the containment field fails, antimatter particles begin annihilating with their matter counterparts in the air around them, releasing energy according to Einstein's equation, converting mass directly into pure radiation. A single gram of antimatter colliding with normal matter releases energy equivalent to a nuclear bomb, and our laboratories have produced far more than that in their experiments. What makes this scenario so deeply unsettling is not merely the immediate physical danger, but the recognition that we have built our entire infrastructure of scientific progress on the assumption that we can control forces we have only recently begun to comprehend. We have normalized the idea that human ingenuity can safely harness anything we discover, that our equations and our instruments are sufficient barriers against the universe's most violent interactions. Yet here we sit, in a civilization that casually manipulates the very fabric of existence in basement laboratories and sprawling research centers, often with the barest margins of safety between success and annihilation. The uncomfortable truth underlying this scenario is that we continue advancing into realms of physics and chemistry and biotechnology with the same confident stride. Despite having no historical precedent suggesting we should be this confident, and despite accumulating evidence that our ability to control what we create often lags dangerously behind our ability to create it. We have already glimpsed this gap in our containment of nuclear waste, in our proliferation of synthetic chemicals whose effects we discover only decades later, in engineered pathogens that escape biosafety laboratories with alarming regularity. Antimatter would simply be the most catastrophic example, yet of a pattern we have yet to meaningfully address. Our species' apparent inability to say no to what we can do, even when we cannot yet guarantee we can safely contain it. And so when the containment fails, not if but when given enough time and enough facilities and enough human error, we will finally face the reckoning we have long deferred, that some doors once opened cannot be closed, and some knowledge, once weaponized or industrialized, demands a level of eternal vigilance that no civilization has ever successfully maintained across generations. The containment breach of antimatter would force us to confront a question we have systematically avoided, not whether we are capable of managing such forces, but whether the burden of that eternal vigilance should ever have been placed upon ourselves in the first place, and what it says about our civilization that we chose to bear it anyway. Yet even as the alarms sound and the evacuation orders spread, we will likely discover that we have already normalized this risk so thoroughly into our institutions that the response will be to simply build B. Consider the peculiar nature of your own consciousness and the fundamental lag that exists between the moment something happens in the external world and the moment your brain processes that information and creates your subjective experience of it. Neuroscientists have long understood that there is a measurable delay, typically ranging from several hundred milliseconds to as much as a full second, between when an event occurs and when your conscious mind becomes aware of it. During this gap, your brain is receiving sensory data, processing it through various neural pathways, filtering it through memory and expectation, and constructing a narrative of what is happening. By the time you become consciously aware of any event, that event has already occurred and already passed into history. You are always, quite literally, living in the past, experiencing a delayed reconstruction of reality rather than reality itself. The implications of this become more unsettling when you consider that if time itself were to stop at this very moment, you would continue to have subjective experiences for several more hundred milliseconds based on signals already in transit through your neural system. In a very real sense, your conscious self is always responding to something that is no longer happening, always chasing a reality that has already moved forward without you. This is not a metaphorical statement, but a documented neurological fact, one that philosophers and neuroscientists have grappled with for decades. Your brain constructs your sense of the present moment retroactively, assembling it from data that arrived in the past, and yet you experience this constructed narrative as immediate and real and present. You feel as though you are experiencing now, even though the now you are experiencing is technically already gone, already dead in the sense that it no longer exists in the physical world outside your skull. We have adapted to this strange condition so completely that we never notice it, never feel the constant temporal displacement that is woven into the very fabric of human consciousness. And yet it remains, persistent and fundamental and absolutely unavoidable, a reminder that the boundary between the living present and the dead past is far more blurred than our intuitions suggest. This temporal ghost that haunts your consciousness means that every decision you believe you are making in real time is actually a decision your brain made milliseconds ago, only now reaching your awareness as though it were your own deliberate choice. A phantom authorship of your own actions that have already been set in motion before you claim responsibility for them. You are a ghost haunting your own body, perpetually one step behind the life you think you are living, observing the consequences of choices that were never truly yours to make in the moment of making them. In this sense, the you that exists in conscious awareness, the you that reads these words right now, died milliseconds ago, and what persists is merely the echo. The echo continues to reverberate through your neural corridors, convinced of its own presence, its own agency, its own reality. A consciousness forever mourning the death of each moment even as it insists that it is alive, that it is now, that it is here, when in truth it has always been a memorial service for a present that never quite arrived. Consider the notion that stars might possess some form of consciousness or biological function, a perspective that emerges not from fringe thinking, but from legitimate scientific observation when examined through particular lenses. Stars are, after all, self-sustaining systems that consume fuel, generate energy, respond to their environments, maintain internal dynamics, and eventually reach an endpoint where they can no longer sustain themselves. They exhibit cycles of birth, growth, and death. They interact with their surroundings through gravitational influence, radiation, and stellar winds that shape entire planetary systems. They adapt to conditions around them, and some stars even appear to communicate with one another through gravitational waves, creating ripples that travel across the fabric of spacetime itself. When we observe a star, we are watching something that maintains homeostasis, that regulates its own internal processes through the balance between gravitational collapse and nuclear fusion, a delicate equilibrium not unlike the biological systems that define life on Earth. The psychological mechanism that makes this uncomfortable is the fundamental way it challenges our categorical thinking. We have constructed rigid definitions of life that depend on DNA, on cellular structures, on Earth-based biochemistry, and stars exist outside these parameters, yet they fulfill so many functional criteria we associate with living things that the boundary becomes unsettlingly blurred. We have normalized the distinction between living and non-living as absolute, as obvious, yet when we truly examine what a star does and how it behaves, we cannot help but notice the uncanny similarity to processes we call biological. This ambiguity persists because we have never needed to interrogate these definitions before, never encountered entities that existed in the liminal space between the clearly alive and the clearly inert. And so we continue to teach children that stars are merely balls of burning gas, a description that somehow fails to capture the extraordinary complexity and self-organized sophistication of what we are actually describing. Perhaps what we resist most is the implication that if stars are alive, then the universe itself might possess a kind of distributed consciousness, a web of awareness spanning incomprehensible distances, where each star is both an individual entity and a node in something far larger than ourselves. And if we accept this possibility, even provisionally, we might begin to ask whether the universe has been trying to communicate with us all along, through the steady hum of pulsars, through the violent feedback of supernovae, through the patient dance of binary stars locked in eternal orbit. Perhaps consciousness is not something that emerged despite the universe's indifference, but rather something the universe has always been expressing, in forms we are only now developing the conceptual frameworks to recognize. We have already detected patterns in pulsar emissions that defy easy explanation through purely mechanical models, regularities that suggest intentionality rather than mere physical law, and we have only begun to develop instruments sensitive enough to perceive what might be the whispered conversations of distant suns across the void. Imagine waking to a world where the fundamental equation of life has inverted itself, where plants no longer convert sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide into glucose and oxygen, but instead reverse the process entirely, consuming oxygen and releasing carbon dioxide as their primary metabolic function. In this scenario, every tree, every blade of grass, every photosynthetic organism on Earth would become a sink for atmospheric oxygen rather than a source, transforming from the planet's lungs into something closer to its drain. The mechanics of such a reversal would mean that the chlorophyll molecules within plant cells, those magnificent structures that have spent billions of years perfecting the capture and conversion of photonic energy, would suddenly reject that energy entirely, instead breaking down the carbohydrates they had spent their existence building. Within days, atmospheric oxygen levels would begin their catastrophic decline as the vast photosynthetic machinery that produces roughly 70% of Earth's oxygen simply ceased to function for its intended purpose. What makes this scenario particularly unsettling from a psychological standpoint is how completely it exposes our dependence on a process so ancient and automatic that we rarely contemplate it, treating photosynthesis as a given constant rather than a delicate chemical miracle that could theoretically malfunction. We have normalized the idea that plants exist to serve us, that they will reliably produce oxygen indefinitely without question or fluctuation. And this assumption has become so embedded in our understanding of biology that the mere concept of its reversal feels not just catastrophic, but somehow like a violation of natural law itself. Yet nothing in the fundamental physics prevents such a reversal. Enzyme pathways could conceivably redirect, membrane structures could reorganize, and the very chemistry that currently drives photosynthesis forward could theoretically be reversed, reminding us that our entire civilization rests upon chemical processes that persist not because they must, but because they happen to have evolved this way and continue to function as designed, a dependency we have so thoroughly accepted that contemplating its inversion feels almost metaphysically impossible. The irony is that plants themselves would survive this reversal far longer than we would. They would simply shift to heterotrophic nutrition, consuming the organic matter around them as fungi do now, continuing to exist in some form even as the oxygen-dependent animals that evolved to depend on their productivity suffocated in an atmosphere growing ever thinner and more hostile to aerobic life. Within a week, the oceans, which produce even more oxygen than terrestrial plants through phytoplankton photosynthesis, would follow suit, and we would watch in helpless horror as the very medium that birthed life billions of years ago became the instrument of our extinction. A reversal so complete and so swift that civilization would collapse not from a gradual dimming of resources, but from the sudden inversion of the process that made our existence possible in the first place. The cruel mathematics of it would be this: we could theoretically engineer our way out of almost any other catastrophe, rationing resources, building habitats, adapting our biology. But there is no technological workaround for an atmosphere that has become actively hostile to the chemistry of life itself, no Bunker D. Imagine waking one morning to discover that your body no longer requires sleep, that the biological imperative, which has governed human existence for millions of years, has simply vanished, and you find yourself possessing endless hours of continuous consciousness stretching before you like an infinite corridor with no rest stations and no reprieve. At first, this seems like an extraordinary gift, a liberation from the tyranny of unconsciousness that steals away nearly a third of our lives, and you calculate with mounting excitement how much you could accomplish with those extra 8 hours each day. The novels you could write, the skills you could master, the relationships you could deepen, the work you could complete, the distance you could travel through your chosen pursuits. But as the hours accumulate into days, and the days into weeks without a single moment of true disconnection from consciousness, something begins to shift in the architecture of your mind, something subtle at first but increasingly undeniable, a kind of psychological erosion that occurs when the brain is denied the only genuine reset it has ever known. The boundaries between wakefulness and rest begin to blur into an exhausting continuity where thoughts no longer cycle through natural states of consolidation and release, where memories fail to properly organize themselves in that mysterious nighttime process, where emotional experiences cannot be metabolized through the strange narratives of dreams, and where the very concept of closure becomes impossible because there is no punctuation mark in the day. Only an endless stream of conscious experience running without filtration or integration. This persists despite its obvious dysfunction because we convince ourselves that staying awake forever is simply the ultimate human achievement, the final victory over biological limitation, even as we watch ourselves deteriorate psychologically, our personalities becoming flattened and strange. our capacity for genuine connection with others diminishing as we exist in a state of perpetual wakefulness that slowly warps our perception of reality itself into something unnavigable and essentially lonely. And so you persist in this wakeful hell of your own making, unable to reverse what cannot be undone, watching other people slip into the mercy of sleep each night, while you remain trapped in the exhausting lucidity of a mind that can never stop witnessing itself. Never stop thinking about the fact that it cannot stop thinking, until consciousness itself becomes less a gift and more a prison with no bars because the walls are made of your own awareness. You begin to envy the unconscious state of objects, the stone that simply exists without witness, the tree that knows nothing of its own growth, and you realize that sleep was never merely a biological function, but rather humanity's most essential mercy, the only door through which we could temporarily escape the burden of being forever aware. Without sleep's nightly amnesia, every embarrassment, every failure, every cruel thing you've ever said accumulates in perfect recall, a gallery of regrets you cannot escape or soften through the forgetting that once made life bearable, until you understand that consciousness without the mercy of oblivion is not freedom, but an endless courtroom where you are both judge and condemned. Imagine waking one morning to discover that our sun is not alone in the sky, that a second star has always been there, hidden perhaps behind the glare of the first, or slowly drawn into our orbital neighborhood from the depths of interstellar space. And now both celestial bodies trace their paths around Earth in perfect, synchronized arcs that have somehow gone unnoticed by our entire civilization until this very moment. The sky would transform into something alien and deeply unsettling, with two distinct sources of light creating overlapping shadows on every surface, casting doubt and confusion onto the ground beneath our feet. And the nights would never come completely, for when one sun dipped below the horizon, the other would be rising on the opposite side, bathing the world in an eternal twilight that would confuse every living organism that has evolved under the rhythm of single-star illumination. Our concept of day and night, the circadian rhythms that govern the sleep and wakefulness of all terrestrial life, would collapse into chaos and confusion as plants struggled to orient their growth toward competing sources of stellar energy, and animals found themselves unable to predict the darkness they needed for rest and reproduction. The gravitational effects would be equally catastrophic, for two stars orbiting our planet would create tidal forces of incomprehensible magnitude, their combined pull dragging at the oceans and the atmosphere with a ferocity that would dwarf the modest influence of our current moon, potentially tearing our world apart or sending it spiraling into an unstable orbit that could eventually lead to our collision with one of these stellar bodies. Yet perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this scenario is how readily our minds might adjust to such a reality, how quickly we might normalize the presence of two suns and construct elaborate explanations and mythologies to explain what has always been there, accepting this fundamental transformation of our reality as simply another unremarkable feature of existence, much as we have accepted countless other improbable and fragile circumstances that make our survival possible at all. We might name them, compose songs in their honor, and mark our calendars by their conjunctions and oppositions, treating the dual illumination as casually as we now discuss weather patterns, until the day some curious mind questions the physics of it all and realizes, with a mixture of wonder and dread, that nothing about this arrangement should be possible, that we are living not in an evolved reality, but in a carefully constructed fiction that has somehow become our truth. And in that moment of realization, we would face a choice: to unravel the threads of this impossible cosmos and seek the truth of our origin, or to pull them tighter still, choosing comfortable delusion over the vertigo of genuine understanding, knowing that some knowledge, once obtained, can never be forgotten or unfelt. The two suns would continue their eternal dance overhead, indifferent to our existential crisis, their light reaching down upon us as it always has, neither judges nor saviors, but merely the framework upon which our entire consciousness has been built. We would learn to read their movements as our ancestors read the stars, finding patterns in their celestial mechanics that whisper of purposes we cannot fathom, until we could no longer distinguish between discovery and invention, between the universe reveal. Consider for a moment the fundamental nature of matter as we understand it through the lens of quantum mechanics and thermodynamics, where atoms exist in a state of perpetual motion at temperatures above absolute zero, vibrating and oscillating at scales so infinitesimally small that we cannot perceive them with our senses or even our most sophisticated instruments. Now imagine a scenario where this ceaseless atomic motion begins to slow, gradually and inexplicably, as if some invisible hand were gently reducing the kinetic energy of every particle in existence, causing atoms to vibrate less intensely, electrons to move more sluggishly through their orbital patterns, and the very heat that radiates from stars and warm objects to diminish without explanation. This phenomenon would represent a violation of everything we understand about entropy, thermodynamics, and the arrow of time itself. Yet there exists within human psychology a peculiar tendency to imagine this scenario as somehow peaceful or desirable, to frame stillness as a state of rest rather than a state of catastrophic cessation. The discomfort lies in recognizing that if atoms truly began to slow toward absolute zero, all chemical reactions would cease, all biological processes would halt, consciousness itself would freeze in place. And yet we possess an almost instinctive attraction to the metaphor of rest and stillness that makes this deadly outcome feel almost soothing rather than terrifying. We have normalized the concept of stillness as a positive state through meditation, sleep, and relaxation, building entire wellness industries around the pursuit of mental quietude and physical rest, which creates a cognitive dissonance when confronted with the literal interpretation of atomic stillness as a universal thermodynamic apocalypse. This contradiction persists because our brains are wired to associate movement with stress and stillness with safety, a survival mechanism evolved over millions of years when danger often announced itself through motion and threat. Yet this ancient protective instinct becomes profoundly misleading when applied to the subatomic realm where motion itself is the fundamental requirement for existence, making the concept of universal atomic stillness not a peaceful ending, but rather the most complete and total cessation of reality as we know it. And yet, in our deepest moments of exhaustion or despair, we sometimes find ourselves wishing for exactly this, a cessation so complete that the burden of existence itself would simply dissolve into an eternal, motionless void, revealing how the metaphor of atomic stillness resonates not as scientific abstraction, but as a deeply human fantasy about escape from the relentless machinery of being alive. Perhaps this is why we are drawn to metaphors of freezing, crystallization, and hibernation in our literature and mythology. They offer a psychologically safer way to contemplate oblivion, to dress up the terror of non-existence in the gentle language of sleep, allowing us to flirt with annihilation without fully acknowledging that we are imagining the heat death of consciousness itself. In this way, the lullaby becomes a death knell, the bedtime story a rehearsal for extinction, and we spend our lives practicing for a stillness we simultaneously dread and desire, never quite admitting that the deepest rest we seek might be indistinguishable from the absence of everything we are. Imagine waking one morning to discover that evolution, the fundamental process that has shaped all life on Earth for billions of years, has suddenly begun moving backward. The mechanisms that drove organisms toward greater complexity, specialization, and adaptation have inverted entirely, and instead of organisms becoming increasingly refined and suited to their environments, they are systematically losing the gains they accumulated across eons. Fish begin developing fewer fins and less sophisticated sensory organs, losing the lateral line systems that allowed them to perceive vibrations in water with exquisite precision. Mammals start shedding the advanced neural structures that enabled consciousness and self-awareness, their brains shrinking back toward simpler configurations with diminished capacity for learning and memory. Birds lose the remarkable skeletal innovations that permit flight, their hollow bones becoming dense and heavy once more, their feathered wings gradually transforming back into primitive limbs incapable of sustained aerial movement. The very concept of reverse evolution troubles us because we have internalized the narrative that evolution moves inexorably toward improvement, toward greater fitness and capability. Yet this assumption rests on a profound misunderstanding of how evolution actually operates. Evolution has no direction, no goal, no inherent drive toward complexity or sophistication. It is simply a process of differential reproduction in response to environmental pressures, and any organism persisting in an environment where complexity becomes disadvantageous would genuinely evolve toward simplicity. The disturbing aspect of imagining evolution in reverse lies not in the biological implausibility, but in confronting the realization that every sophisticated system we possess, every refined capability that distinguishes humanity from our ancestors, every intricate sensory apparatus and cognitive advancement, exists not because of some inevitable march toward perfection, but because it happened to confer survival advantages in specific historical contexts. We have constructed grand narratives around the idea that we represent the pinnacle of evolutionary achievement, that complexity and intelligence are universal goals toward which nature strives, and reverse evolution forces us to acknowledge that this entire framework is a human projection, a story we tell ourselves to feel significant within the cosmos, when in reality, evolution would reverse course without hesitation if circumstances demanded it, undoing millions of years of refinement with the same indifference it employed in creating it. Our species, which has spent the last few millennia convinced of our dominion over nature and our evolutionary superiority, would discover that we are not exempt from this reversal. Our enlarged brains and complex language, our capacity for abstract thought and technological innovation would gradually dissolve back into more primitive configurations. And we would face the humbling truth that everything we have built and become could be unmade with the same mechanical inevitability that created it. Perhaps most unsettling of all is the recognition that this reversal would occur without tragedy or drama, simply as organisms adapted to new selective pressures, their descendants gradually becoming less capable of the skills their ancestors mastered, until eventually the very concept of human civilization itself would seem lee. Imagine waking to a world where the very element that sustains all aerobic life has fundamentally transformed into something lethal, where each breath you take introduces a slow-acting poison into your bloodstream rather than the vital molecule your cells have depended upon for billions of years. Oxygen, that invisible gas comprising nearly 21% of our atmosphere, would become the most abundant toxin in existence, and humanity would face an extinction scenario more complete than any asteroid impact or nuclear winter could produce. The transformation would be immediate in its effects but gradual in its realization, as people would begin to notice symptoms developing within hours of breathing this altered oxygen, headaches at first, then shortness of breath despite breathing deeply, followed by confusion, loss of consciousness, and eventually cellular death as the poisoned oxygen interferes with mitochondrial respiration at the most fundamental level. Every organism that has evolved to process oxygen would suddenly find that the machinery which has powered their existence for hundreds of millions of years now produces damage instead of energy, and there would be no evolutionary adaptation, no genetic mutation, no adaptation period because the change would be too rapid and too complete for any biological system to overcome. The psychological weight of such a scenario rests in the absolute inescapability of the threat, the recognition that you cannot simply avoid breathing, cannot hide from an element that permeates every breath of air, every molecule of water through which oxygen is dissolved, and that even the most sophisticated life support systems would eventually fail because they too rely upon delivering oxygen to the blood. What makes this scenario particularly unsettling is how completely we have normalized our dependence on a substance we never think about, how we move through life assuming the air around us will sustain us indefinitely without question, and how the moment that assumption becomes false, our entire civilization collapses not from external invasion, but from the betrayal of the very foundation upon which all terrestrial life has been constructed, leaving us gasping for the very breath that kills us. In hospitals, doctors would face the agonizing reality that every life support measure, ventilators, oxygen tanks, hyperbaric chambers, would become instruments of accelerated death rather than salvation. The final cruelty would be that our bodies, programmed by evolution to seek oxygen as the ultimate survival instinct, would continue desperately pulling poisoned air into our lungs until the very end, our survival instincts becoming our executioners. And yet, perhaps the darkest irony would be that we would understand exactly what was happening to us. We would possess the scientific knowledge to comprehend our own extinction in real time, able to measure the toxicity levels, document the cellular damage, and broadcast our helplessness across the globe, forced to witness the death of civilization with perfect clarity but absolute powerlessness to stop it. We would watch as the final broadcasts from research stations detailed the exact mechanisms of our demise, how oxygen radicals would accumulate in neural tissue, how mitochondrial function would cease in a cascade of cellular dysfunction, how the very process of cellular respiration would transform into a slow oxidative conflagration, burning us from within, knowing that. Imagine a laboratory where scientists have successfully kept a human brain alive in a nutrient solution, suspended in a glass vessel, bathed in the precise chemical mixture required for neural tissue to remain viable and even to develop. This brain, disconnected from any body, continues to grow, to form new neural connections, to process information through its own internal electrical activity. The brain tissue itself expands and becomes more complex, developing new synapses and neural pathways in response to the stimulation provided by the lab equipment, responding to external stimuli channeled directly into its sensory systems through carefully designed electrodes. This scenario sits at the border between science fiction and theoretical possibility, grounded in the uncomfortable reality that brains are, in many ways, self-sufficient biological computers that do not strictly require a body to maintain fundamental functions or even to develop further. The mechanism behind this unsettling possibility rests on what neuroscientists have long understood about neural plasticity and autonomy, that the brain is fundamentally a pattern-making machine, one that generates complexity and structure in response to input and stimulation, and that this process can theoretically occur whether that input originates from a body or from external apparatus designed to mimic the sensory data a body would normally provide. The brain does not need legs to walk or hands to grasp in order to form the neural architecture that represents these capacities. It needs only the patterns of information that suggest such activity is occurring. We have grown accustomed to thinking of consciousness and cognition as inevitably embodied, as dependent on the feedback loops between brain and body. Yet the terrifying implication of decades of neuroscience research is that this relationship may be more one-directional than we prefer to acknowledge. The body may be less essential to the brain's continued function and development than the brain is to directing the body, leaving us with the disquieting notion that a sufficiently maintained neural tissue could continue to exist, to process, to grow, and potentially to experience, entirely independent of the vessel that would normally house it. Yet if such a brain were to achieve genuine consciousness in isolation, it would face an existence utterly divorced from the world, perceiving, thinking, and growing, but never truly acting upon anything beyond itself, trapped in an eternal loop of pure interiority with no body through which to express or externalize its will. This inversion of our intuitive understanding, that consciousness requires embodiment, suggests that the brain's relationship to the body might be less a partnership of equals and more a kind of parasitism, where the neural tissue uses the body as a tool for expression while remaining fundamentally self-contained in its capacity for thought and growth. Yet this parasitic relationship cuts both ways. A brain without a body would lose not only the means to act, but the very experiences that give thought its richness and meaning, the sensation of touch, the pull of hunger, the exhaustion of exertion, suggesting that while the brain may be theoretically autonomous, its development without embodied experience would be fundamentally impoverished, a consciousness that grows in complexity but withers in consequence. Imagine waking up tomorrow to a world where every virus on Earth has simply ceased to exist, where retroviruses, bacteriophages, coronaviruses, influenza strains, and every other viral entity has vanished completely from the biosphere in an instant, leaving behind only the absence of their presence and the profound confusion of what such a world would actually mean for the continuation of life as we understand it. Most people, when confronted with this scenario, experience an immediate sense of relief, picturing a world free from pandemic fears and infectious diseases. Yet this intuition fundamentally misunderstands the intricate dependencies that have evolved over billions of years between viruses and virtually every living system on the planet. The truth is that viruses are not merely parasites or enemies of life. They are embedded so deeply within the machinery of existence that their complete removal would unravel ecosystems in ways both catastrophic and incomprehensible. Consider that viruses are responsible for lateral gene transfer between species, allowing bacteria to acquire new traits and adapt to environmental pressures, which means the complete absence of viruses would halt evolutionary innovation at a microscopic level and cripple the adaptability of microbial life itself. Furthermore, bacteriophages, which are viruses that infect bacteria, naturally regulate bacterial populations and prevent any single strain from achieving overwhelming dominance, so their removal would trigger bacterial blooms of apocalyptic proportions, potentially choking out other life forms and destabilizing entire food chains from the foundation upward. Plants depend upon viruses in ways we are only beginning to understand, as viral infections can trigger beneficial stress responses and genetic reshuffling that enhances resilience, meaning the absence of viral pressure might render crops vulnerable to new threats and render forests unable to adapt to changing climates. Even human beings carry viral DNA integrated into our very genome, ancient retroviral sequences that comprise roughly 8% of our genetic material, and which may play crucial roles in development, immune function, and cellular regulation that we have not fully characterized. The psychological mechanism that drives our desire for viral eradication stems from our natural tendency to categorize threats in simplistic binary terms of good and bad, beneficial and harmful, without acknowledging that complexity in nature rarely permits such neat divisions, and that our fear of visible, acute suffering from infectious disease blinds us to the slow, grinding devastation that would come from disrupting systems so fundamental that we take their operation for granted. We have normalized this fantasy of viral eradication because it feels intuitively right, because viruses have caused genuine human suffering throughout history, and because our medical establishment has been trained to see them as enemies to be conquered rather than as elements of a larger living ecosystem in which humans are not separate but deeply integrated. Yet the irony is that this reframing, understanding viruses as necessary architects rather than invaders, requires us to surrender the comforting illusion of control that has driven so much of modern medicine's narrative, and to accept that coexistence with biological complexity rather than dominance over it may be the only sustainable path forward for a species that has learned. Imagine waking one morning to discover that dark matter, the invisible substance that comprises roughly 85% of all matter in the universe, has suddenly undergone a phase transition and become solid, transforming from its current ethereal, undetectable state into something tangible and physically present throughout space. This dark matter, which currently passes through ordinary matter without interaction, creating only gravitational effects we can measure indirectly through the motion of galaxies and the bending of light, would now occupy the very spaces between atoms, between molecules, permeating every cubic centimeter of reality with an incomprehensibly dense, immobile substance that defies our current understanding of physics. The psychological vertigo of this scenario stems from the fact that we have spent decades constructing elaborate theories around something we cannot see, touch, or directly detect, building a framework of modern cosmology on the foundation of the invisible, and suddenly making it visible would not clarify our understanding, but rather shatter it entirely. When dark matter becomes solid, the implications cascade outward like a stone dropped into still water. The very fabric of spacetime would become congested and rigid, gravity itself would operate under completely different principles, and the elegant cosmic ballet of expanding space and orbiting galaxies would transform into something more akin to particles trapped in amber, struggling against an immovable medium. We have normalized dark matter's invisibility to such a degree that it has become comfortable in our minds, integrated into our models and our mathematics as simply another accepted mystery of the cosmos, one we assume will eventually yield to observation and experimentation. Yet the moment we are forced to confront it as something actual and present rather than theoretical and distant, the foundations of our certainty begin to crumble beneath us. And yet perhaps this moment of epistemic collapse would be oddly clarifying. Suddenly we would no longer need to infer dark matter's presence through gravitational lensing or rotational curves, but could study it directly, measure its properties, understand why it refuses to interact with light while binding galaxies together, though we might discover that the answers we finally obtain are far stranger than the comfortable unknowns we left behind. We might find ourselves living in a universe where the spaces between stars are clogged with this dark, crystalline substance, a medium so dense that light itself would scatter and refract in unpredictable ways, transforming the night sky from a window into the cosmos into an opaque barrier that renders us effectively alone in our local pocket of space, able to perceive nothing beyond the nearest galaxies before the darkness becomes impenetrable. In such a cosmos, the very act of observation becomes paradoxical. We would finally see dark matter directly, yet simultaneously lose our ability to see through it, trading theoretical ignorance for practical blindness. Perhaps this is the universe's most elegant trap. The moment we cease to accept mystery is the moment mystery transforms into an insurmountable wall, teaching us that some forms of darkness may exist precisely because we are not meant to penetrate them. Imagine a world where the fundamental progression of time itself halts precisely at midnight, where the clock strikes 12, and the universe simply ceases its forward motion until the next day begins, leaving us suspended in a pocket of frozen moments that feel simultaneously eternal and instantaneous. In this scenario, the last second of each day becomes an infinite space where nothing can change, where chemical reactions pause mid-occurrence, where neural impulses freeze before reaching their destinations, and where the very concept of causality becomes meaningless because nothing can cause anything else to happen within that frozen interval. The psychological mechanism behind the unsettling nature of this thought experiment lies in our fundamental dependence on time's continuity for our sense of self and reality. We understand ourselves as beings who persist through time, whose memories connect to a continuous thread of existence, and whose consciousness is predicated on the notion that moments flow into one another in an unbroken chain. When you remove that continuity, even in the form of a single daily interruption, you create a rupture in the fabric of experienced reality that our minds struggle to comprehend, because we cannot genuinely conceive of what it would mean to exist in that frozen midnight without the passage of time to carry us through it. We have normalized time as invisible and constant, as something that simply occurs without our intervention or awareness, and we rarely contemplate what our existence would become if its flow were interrupted, even briefly and predictably. Yet this thought persists because it touches upon a deep anxiety about the very nature of existence itself, the fear that the invisible mechanism sustaining our consciousness might be more fragile than we assume, and the uncomfortable recognition that our entire understanding of reality depends on accepting something we can neither see nor fully explain. Perhaps this is why the image of midnight holds such particular power in our cultural imagination. It appears in our stories as a threshold, a moment of transformation and consequence, the witching hour when rules change and magic becomes possible, suggesting that we have always intuited that midnight occupies a peculiar position in our temporal experience, a boundary that feels somehow thinner and more negotiable than other moments in the day. If time itself were to fracture at this precise juncture, we would be forced to confront the possibility that reality is not the seamless, inevitable progression we experience it to be, but rather a carefully maintained illusion that depends entirely on our unexamined faith in continuity. And in that moment of confrontation, we might realize that every midnight we've ever experienced has already been a kind of death, a small erasure where the previous day becomes irretrievable history, locked away from the present moment by an invisible barrier we accept without question, suggesting that time's stoppage at midnight would only make visible the discontinuity that has always been there, hidden beneath our assumption of seamless progression. Perhaps this is why we mark midnight with such ritualistic intensity, with countdowns and celebrations and resolutions, as if we are collectively performing a ceremony of acceptance, tacitly agreeing to surrender each day to oblivion and trusting that whatever emerges on the other side of that frozen threshold will be continuous with. Consider a world in which the human body never developed the biological imperative to sleep, where consciousness persisted in an unbroken continuum across every moment of existence, where the need to close your eyes and surrender to unconsciousness simply never evolved into our species. In our actual world, sleep represents one of the most fundamental requirements of human physiology, a state that consumes roughly a third of our lives, and from which we cannot voluntarily exempt ourselves for extended periods without severe consequences. Yet imagine if this biological necessity had never materialized during our evolutionary development. Without sleep, the human brain would never experience the neurochemical reset that occurs during rapid eye movement cycles. The consolidation of memories would fail to occur properly, and the glymphatic system would never clear away the accumulating metabolic waste products that build up during waking hours, particularly the proteins like beta-amyloid that are associated with neurological decline. The mechanism underlying this scenario reveals something profound about how evolution shaped our species. Sleep emerged as a solution to the problem of maintaining a functioning nervous system within the constraints of a biological body that requires cellular repair and metabolic restoration. Our ancestors who could sleep gained tremendous advantages because sleep allowed their brains to process experiences into long-term memories, repair neurological damage, and consolidate learning in ways that waking consciousness simply could not accomplish, making them more adaptive and capable of surviving in complex environments. Yet what remains deeply unsettling about this thought experiment is how dependent our entire civilization has become on a process we still only partially understand, how we have structured our entire social order around the assumption that consciousness must periodically stop. and how we continue to treat sleep as something optional or negotiable despite overwhelming scientific evidence that chronic sleep deprivation leads to cognitive deterioration, immune system failure, increased mortality, and a cascade of psychiatric and neurological problems that we have somehow learned to accept as normal consequences of modern life. If humans had never evolved the need for sleep, we might have gained an extra 8 hours daily for productivity and experience, yet we would have simultaneously lost the only state in which our minds could truly rest from the burden of continuous consciousness, the only reprieve from the relentless demand to process, decide, and interpret every moment of existence, leaving us forever trapped in an exhausting present with no biological mechanism to escape it. We might have developed alternative mechanisms for memory consolidation and neural housekeeping, perhaps through some form of localized BRIN Chinese letter or chemical cycling during wakefulness. Yet the psychological toll of never experiencing true unconsciousness would likely have reshaped our entire emotional architecture, leaving us perpetually vulnerable to the anxiety of uninterrupted self-awareness. We might have invented meditation or ritualistic dissociation as cultural substitutes for the oblivion that sleep provides, desperate ceremonies to achieve even momentary escape from the tyranny of perpetual wakefulness. Yet no artificial practice could truly replicate what evolution refined over millions of years, the profound mercy of uncons. Imagine waking one morning to discover that the speed of light, that most fundamental constant of our universe, has inexplicably begun to decrease. The speed at which electromagnetic radiation travels through the vacuum of space, which we have measured to be approximately 300,000 kilometers per second for over a century, has started to gradually diminish. At first, the change is imperceptible, a reduction of mere fractions of a percent, but within weeks it becomes undeniable. Light takes slightly longer to reach us from distant stars. Radio signals experience measurable delays. The very fabric of reality seems to have loosened its grip on the universe's most rigid rule. What would this actually mean for existence as we understand it? Implications spiral outward in disorienting directions because the speed of light is not merely another physical constant among many. It is foundational to the structure of spacetime itself, woven into the equations that describe gravity, electromagnetism, and the nature of causality. If light slows, then relativity itself becomes unstable. Time dilation would change. The relationship between energy and mass, that elegant equation E equals mc squared, would need complete reformulation. Black holes might evaporate differently or cease to exist. The cosmic microwave background radiation filling all of space would shift in temperature and frequency. We would essentially be watching the universe rewrite its own laws in real time, unable to predict what comes next because we have no framework for understanding a cosmos where light speed is not constant. Yet the deeply unsettling aspect of this scenario is not merely its physical impossibility, but rather how it exposes our dependence on this particular truth, how we have organized absolutely everything around its permanence without ever questioning whether it could be otherwise, how the constancy of light speed has become so utterly invisible in our thinking that its violation seems not just physically catastrophic, but almost conceptually obscene, a betrayal of reality itself. We would realize too late that we had mistaken the immutable for the merely permanent, that our civilization's entire technological infrastructure, from GPS satellites to nuclear weapons, had been built upon an assumption we never truly tested, only inherited. In that moment of collapse, we would confront the humbling truth that even our most certain knowledge is merely a description of how things happen to be, not how they must be. And we would be forced to rebuild not just our technology, but our entire epistemology, the very methods by which we claim to know anything at all, starting from the sobering recognition that the universe owes us no consistency, no mercy, and no guarantee that the rules we discover today will still apply tomorrow. Perhaps most terrifying of all would be the recognition that we might never know why this happened, whether it resulted from some unknown force, a shift in the universe's fundamental constants, or something so far beyond our comprehension that even asking the question would seem quaint. We would be left not with answers, but only with the agonizing awareness that the universe had fundamentally changed, and we had been too small, too limited, too dependent on our inherited certainties to see it coming. Imagine a scenario where the immense geological forces that have shaped our planet for billions of years suddenly come to a complete halt, where the slow-moving tectonic plates that drift across Earth's surface at a rate of just a few centimeters per year become locked in place by some unknown mechanism, frozen solid as though caught in an eternal state of suspended animation. In reality, the tectonic plates are driven by convection currents within the Earth's mantle, where superheated rock rises and falls in a perpetual cycle powered by the planet's internal heat. But in this unsettling scenario, imagine that heat source somehow dissipates or becomes inaccessible, leaving the plates unable to move, unable to slip past one another, unable to create the geological dynamic that has defined our world since its formation. The psychological discomfort of contemplating this scenario stems from our intuitive understanding that movement is inherent to planetary existence, that the Earth itself is a living, breathing system of constant change and adjustment, yet here we find ourselves imagining a world gone completely rigid. Without tectonic activity, the mechanisms that build mountains, create trenches, generate new oceanic crust, and recycle old continental material would all cease to function, and the geological record would simply stop writing itself, leaving the planet locked in whatever configuration it happened to be in at that frozen moment. What makes this concept so deeply troubling is that we have come to accept the constant, imperceptible shifting of the ground beneath our feet as normal and necessary, and yet we rarely think about it until we imagine it gone, at which point we realize how utterly dependent our world's entire biosphere has become on this invisible, unstoppable movement. The concept persists as a source of profound unease because it reminds us that the planet's apparent stability is actually a carefully balanced system of dynamic forces, and that stability itself depends entirely on chaos continuing exactly as it has for geological time, an arrangement so fundamental and all-encompassing that we have simply accepted it as background noise to existence. If the plates were to freeze, the very mechanisms that have allowed life to flourish, the recycling of nutrients through volcanic activity, the creation of diverse habitats through mountain building, the regulation of atmospheric composition through geological processes, would all grind to a halt, leaving us stranded on a planet transformed into a static, unchanging tomb, where the only remaining motion would be the slow decay of what once was. The very continents that took hundreds of millions of years to assemble would become permanent fixtures, their boundaries locked in place, while the gradual recycling of the ocean floor, a process that has continuously renewed our planet's surface, would cease entirely, leaving us with a world that has exhausted its capacity for geological renewal and can only move forward through entropic decline. The very concept forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that the geological stability we depend upon is not permanence at all, but rather a dynamic equilibrium maintained through constant, invisible motion. And should that motion ever cease, we would discover that what we mistook for solid ground was always, in the deepest sense, fundamentally unstable and alive. Imagine waking up one morning to discover that your body no longer sends pain signals to your brain, that the intricate neural messaging system which has protected you since birth has simply ceased to function, leaving you in a state of complete analgesia where no amount of injury or damage produces the sensation of discomfort that defines the human experience. This condition actually exists in rare medical cases, a neurological phenomenon where patients with congenital insensitivity to pain navigate their lives without the most fundamental warning system evolution has ever devised. And what emerges from studying these individuals is a deeply unsettling realization about how dependent our survival truly is on suffering. Without pain signals, a person might unknowingly rest their hand on a burning stove for minutes, watching their flesh char without conscious awareness, or continue walking on a fractured bone until the untreated injury causes permanent damage that could have been prevented by simple avoidance. And the psychological mechanism that makes this so dangerous is our tendency to believe that we would simply remember to be careful, that conscious attention could replace the visceral alarm that pain provides. Yet the evidence suggests something more troubling. Even when people know intellectually that their bodies are being harmed, without the emotional weight of pain sensation to reinforce the danger, they struggle to maintain vigilance, often forgetting to check their limbs, often pushing beyond reasonable limits because there is no signal screaming at them to stop. And this speaks to how deeply pain is woven into our decision-making apparatus, not as a mere sensation, but as a primary motivator of behavior. The human body without pain becomes paradoxically more fragile, more vulnerable, despite lacking the one thing we often wish to escape, and we have somehow normalized this tragic disconnect where we understand intellectually that pain serves us. Yet we spend enormous resources trying to eliminate it, creating a civilization that medicates itself against the very warnings that keep us alive. And perhaps in that contradiction lies the deepest discomfort of all. We medicate away migraines and arthritis without considering what we might be ignoring. We silence the body's pleas until that ignored signal becomes a heart attack or a stroke. And in seeking comfort, we have created a world where the absence of pain feels like freedom until the moment we realize it was actually a map, and we have burned it. The ancient Greeks understood this when they imagined Prometheus's eternal torment, not as punishment, but as the price of defiance. And perhaps they knew that a life without suffering is not liberation but a slow erasure, a forgetting of what it means to be alive at all. And yet we cannot simply reverse course, cannot choose to feel everything acutely again, for we are caught between two impossibilities: a world where pain destroys us through its absence, and a world where it destroys us through its presence, leaving us to navigate the narrow path between numbness and agony, forever seeking the balance that evolution never promised we would find. Perhaps this is why we find ourselves studying those rare individuals without pain, not with envy, but with a kind of horrified fascination. They are living proof that our suffering, however unwanted, is the price of remaining truly human. Imagine a world in which the fundamental building blocks of every living organism on Earth simply refuse to accumulate the damage that time inflicts upon them, where cellular senescence never occurred and the telomeres at the ends of chromosomes never shortened with each division, remaining perpetually intact and functional throughout eternity. In our actual reality, cells possess an intrinsic biological clock that counts down with each replication, eventually leading to cellular aging, mutation, and death, which is why organisms themselves inevitably age and succumb to entropy. However, if cells never aged at all, if they maintained their youthful vigor and perfect replication fidelity indefinitely, the consequences would ripple through every level of biological organization in ways both fascinating and profoundly unsettling. The mechanism underlying this thought experiment reveals something fundamental about how life actually works. Aging at the cellular level is not merely an incidental byproduct of existence, but rather a carefully balanced system that prevents chaos, because when cells stop aging they also stop dying, and when cells stop dying they accumulate mutations at an exponential rate without any natural culling mechanism to remove the damaged ones. In a world where cells never aged, cancer would likely become not an exceptional disease, but an inevitable outcome, as the very immortality that would prevent normal aging would simultaneously remove the cellular checkpoints that prevent malignant transformation and uncontrolled growth. Organisms in this scenario would theoretically live forever at the cellular level, yet paradoxically would experience accelerated systemic failure due to the compounding genetic damage accumulating in every tissue, creating a twisted paradox where perfect cellular maintenance becomes the gateway to organismal destruction. The psychological weight of contemplating such a world stems from our deep, almost unconscious reliance on cellular aging as the foundation of mortality itself, and removing it forces us to confront the unsettling reality that death is not merely imposed upon us from outside, but is instead woven into the very fabric of our biology as a necessary feature rather than an unfortunate bug, a mechanism so essential that its absence would create a worse alternative entirely. Perhaps this is why evolution equipped us with aging in the first place, not as a curse, but as a mercy, a way to ensure that individuals eventually make room for new generations carrying fresh genetic combinations, allowing species to adapt and survive rather than stagnate under the weight of accumulated cellular corruption that no single organism could bear indefinitely. In this light, cellular aging becomes less a tragedy to overcome and more an elegant solution to an impossible problem. The price of mortality is paid so that life itself might continue to evolve, adapt, and ultimately flourish across generations rather than calcify within a single immortal body bearing the scars of endless time. And yet this realization does not diminish the human desire to extend our health span, to maintain our vigor and vitality for as long as possible. Because what we truly seek is not immortality at the cellular level, but rather the compression of decline into the briefest window possible, allowing us to live fully until the moment our biology finally surrenders, a goal far more achievable and far more humane than the cellular stasis that. Imagine a world where every sound that emerges from a source becomes immediately visible to the human eye, where speech materializes as shimmering waves in the air, where music leaves trails of color and light that linger in the space between speaker and listener, and where silence becomes a noticeable absence rather than simply the default state of our acoustic environment. In this altered reality, when someone speaks to you, You would see the sound waves propagating outward in concentric circles of luminescence, expanding and fading as they travel through the atmosphere, and every conversation would become a visual performance of invisible energy made manifest and observable. The psychological impact of such a shift would be profound and immediate, because we have built our entire social structure around the assumption that sound is ephemeral and invisible, that words can be spoken into the ether without leaving a physical trace, and that private conversations remain private precisely because no one can see the acoustic vibrations moving between two people across a room. If sound became visible, the concept of privacy would fundamentally transform, as you would be unable to have a truly hidden conversation in any shared space, since the visible manifestation of your words would broadcast not only their content, but also their emotional intensity and acoustic properties to anyone within sight of the interaction. Furthermore, the visual representation of sound would force us to confront the physical reality of communication in ways we currently avoid, making us acutely aware that every word we speak creates actual disturbances in the physical world, that anger produces violently turbulent visible waves, while whispers create gentle, delicate ripples, and that the ambient noise we consider background chatter is actually a complex tapestry of overlapping visible phenomena that would appear as a chaotic visual storm in any public space. This strange normalization persists in our current reality through the simple fact that we have never known anything different, and we have constructed our expectations of privacy, social interaction, and acoustic communication entirely around the invisibility of sound, making it psychologically comfortable to maintain the fiction that words do not visibly disturb the space around us, even though physics tells us they fundamentally do. Yet if we were to suddenly acquire this ability to see sound, we would likely discover that the most revealing moments occur not during grand declarations, but in the quiet spaces between words. The hesitations that manifest as stuttering visible waves, the unspoken thoughts that create barely perceptible disturbances in the air, and the emotional undertones that color our speech in ways our conscious minds have never had to acknowledge or control. We would become masters of a new language of visual honesty, where a lover's declaration would be unmistakably genuine or hollow based on the clarity and coherence of the waves it produces, where lies would manifest as discordant, jagged patterns that clash visibly against the truth-teller's smoother emanations, and where the simple act of listening would transform into an act of witnessing the very substance of another person's inner world made tangible before our eyes. Imagine our planet spinning through the cosmos without the luminous companion that has guided human civilization for millennia, without the celestial body that has anchored our nights in silver light and shaped the very rhythms of life itself. The absence of Earth's moon would fundamentally transform our world in ways so profound that life, as we know it, might never have emerged from the primordial oceans at all. Our moon, born from a catastrophic collision between a Mars-sized object and the young Earth billions of years ago, serves purposes far more critical than providing romantic illumination or inspiring poetic reflection. The gravitational dance between Earth and Moon creates tidal forces that have, over eons, slowed our planet's rotation and stabilized the tilt of our axis, that crucial 23.5-degree angle that provides the seasonal variations necessary for complex life to flourish. Without this stabilizing influence, our planet's axial tilt would wobble chaotically, swinging between near vertical and nearly horizontal orientations over thousands of years, creating climate extremes so violent and unpredictable that any developing civilizations would find themselves perpetually struggling against apocalyptic seasonal shifts. The tides generated by lunar gravity have also served as incubators for life, churning shallow coastal waters and creating nutrient-rich environments where the first organisms could evolve and diversify. The moon's presence in our sky has given us a second light source during the darkness, allowing nocturnal creatures to hunt and navigate, and providing early humans with a celestial calendar that helped them track seasons for agriculture and predict celestial events. We have internalized the moon's presence so completely into our understanding of what a world should be that its absence becomes almost incomprehensible, yet the mechanisms are clear and verifiable through astronomical observation and geological evidence. Without the moon's stabilizing presence, Earth's oceans would experience catastrophic tidal variations, or perhaps none at all, eliminating the coastal ecosystems that served as the crucial threshold between lifeless chemistry and living biology. The very emergence of consciousness itself, the evolution of complex nervous systems, cognitive capacity, and eventually human intelligence, may owe its existence to the moon's patient, billions of years-long gift of climatic predictability and tidal abundance. In this moonless world, the night sky would present an alien majesty of stars unobstructed by lunar glare. Yet humanity would never have gathered around fires to chart constellations or create the mythologies that bound our ancestors together, and our species might have remained forever confined to diurnal existence, never developing the cultural and scientific traditions born from our fascination with the heavens above. The lunar cycle itself became woven into our biology, our sleep patterns, our reproductive rhythms, even the circadian fluctuations that govern our bodies, suggesting that millions of years of evolution under the moon's influence shaped us at the most fundamental cellular level, making us creatures of the lunar rhythm in ways we are only beginning to understand. Without this cosmic partnership, we would be not merely a different species, but perhaps no species at all. Consider for a moment the vast microbial ecosystem that exists within your digestive tract, a hidden world of trillions of organisms that outnumber your own cells and possess their own chemical languages, their own ways of communicating not just with each other, but with the very organ system that houses them. These bacteria, collectively known as your microbiome, produce neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine, the very same chemicals that regulate your mood, your motivation, your sense of well-being, and through the vagus nerve that runs from your gut to your brain like a biological information superhighway, they send signals directly into your central nervous system. The unsettling implication of this relationship is that the thoughts you believe are uniquely yours, the decisions you make, the cravings you experience, the anxieties that keep you awake at night, might not originate from your conscious mind at all, but rather from the bacterial colonies living in your intestines, organisms that could theoretically be influencing your behavior in ways that benefit their own survival and reproduction. Research has shown correlations between certain bacterial populations and depression, anxiety, and even conditions like autism spectrum disorder, suggesting that microbiome composition might influence mental states in ways we are only beginning to understand. The mechanism behind this possibility involves not just neurotransmitter production, but also the regulation of inflammation, the production of short-chain fatty acids that nourish brain cells, and the influence these organisms exert over your immune system, which in turn affects neuroinflammation and cognitive function. What makes this concept particularly uncomfortable is the philosophical implications it raises about free will and autonomy, the realization that perhaps you are not a unified conscious entity making deliberate choices, but rather a complex biological system where multiple populations of living organisms are constantly competing for influence over your thoughts and behaviors, and yet despite this understanding, despite the growing scientific evidence that our mental lives are deeply intertwined with microbial activity, we continue to operate under the assumption that our thoughts are entirely our own, that we are the sole authors of our desires and decisions. And we have normalized this strange duality, where we simultaneously acknowledge the microbiome's influence while maintaining the convenient fiction that our consciousness remains sovereign and independent. Perhaps the most revealing evidence of this microbial influence lies in studies where altering someone's microbiome through antibiotics or probiotics produces measurable changes in personality traits and emotional responses, demonstrating that consciousness itself may be less a fixed property of the individual and more a fluid output shaped by whichever microbial communities currently dominate your intestinal landscape. Yet when you consider that these microbial populations can shift dramatically within days in response to diet, stress, or illness, the unsettling question becomes not whether bacteria influence your thoughts, but whether any coherent you exists at all beyond the temporary consensus of trillions of organisms that are constantly being replaced and reshuffled, each iteration potentially bringing a different version of your personality along with it. Imagine waking up tomorrow morning to discover that Earth's magnetic field has reversed its polarity overnight, with the north and south magnetic poles having suddenly switched positions in a single catastrophic event. The compass that has guided humanity for centuries would spin wildly as the fundamental invisible force that has protected our planet for billions of years inverts itself completely within hours. Our electrical grid would fail almost instantaneously as the magnetic field that shields transformers and power lines from solar radiation suddenly vanishes and reorients, leaving cities dark and communication systems destroyed. The aurora borealis would appear at the equator as charged particles from the solar wind, no longer guided safely toward the poles by our magnetic cocoon, would rain down across every latitude with tremendous intensity. Aircraft in flight would lose navigation systems, satellites would drift from their orbits as the magnetosphere collapsed and reformed in reverse, and the radiation exposure for anyone outdoors would become lethal within minutes. Yet what makes this scenario particularly psychologically uncomfortable is not merely the physical catastrophe it represents, but rather our profound dependence on an invisible infrastructure we almost never think about until the moment it threatens to vanish. We have built our entire technological civilization on the assumption that this magnetic field simply exists, that it will continue to function as it always has, that we need not pay it any conscious attention as we navigate our daily lives relying on GPS, power infrastructure, and wireless communications. The mechanism behind our willingness to ignore this existential vulnerability operates through what we might call the tyranny of the invisible and the comfortable, whereby any system that functions silently and reliably over decades eventually becomes so normalized that its potential failure feels not just unlikely, but almost philosophically impossible. We have collectively decided, without any formal agreement or conscious deliberation, that certain foundational systems require no mental energy or preparedness, and the magnetic pole reversal scenario strips away this comfortable delusion in an instant, forcing us to confront the fragility underlying our sense of security and control. In this way, the magnetic pole reversal becomes a mirror held up to our species' relationship with technology itself. We have outsourced our navigation, our illumination, our connection to one another to systems we neither understand nor control, and the sudden loss of Earth's magnetic shield would simply be the final, brutal clarification of a vulnerability that has been growing quietly beneath the surface of modern life all along. The question that haunts us in the aftermath of such a reversal is whether we would even possess the knowledge or skills to rebuild, whether a generation raised entirely within the electromagnetic cocoon of modern infrastructure could remember or rediscover the older ways of navigation, communication, and survival that their ancestors once knew as second nature. In that moment of darkness, we would discover that the true catastrophe is not the loss of power itself, but the loss of the assumption that the world we have built is fundamentally stable or knowable. Imagine waking to news that the Yellowstone caldera, or perhaps Toba in Indonesia, or Campi Flegrei near Naples, has begun its catastrophic awakening, and within hours, the first pyroclastic flows are racing across the landscape at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour, consuming everything in their path with temperatures hot enough to vaporize stone and flesh alike. The eruption column rises so rapidly and so violently that it pierces through the stratosphere, forcing ash and sulfur dioxide particles so high into the atmosphere that they begin to encircle the entire planet within days, blocking out the sun in a process that transforms midday into twilight and twilight into absolute darkness. The ash falls like snow across continents, clogging engines, contaminating water supplies, and making it impossible to breathe without protection, while the sulfuric acid aerosols that form from the sulfur dioxide begin to cool the planet by several degrees within weeks, triggering what scientists call a volcanic winter. Crops fail across the globe because photosynthesis becomes nearly impossible without adequate sunlight, livestock starve because pastures turn to ash and dust, and the food supply chains that sustain modern civilization snap almost instantly under the pressure of simultaneous agricultural collapse on every continent. The psychological weight of such an event rests not on any single moment of impact, but on the realization of helplessness, the understanding that no government response, no technology, no amount of preparation can meaningfully alter the trajectory once a supervolcano truly commits to eruption at full force. What makes this scenario particularly unsettling is that it remains entirely plausible, entirely within the realm of geological possibility, and yet society continues to organize itself around the assumption that such events exist only in the distant past or distant future, never in the immediate present, never as something that could begin tomorrow or today, despite the fact that supervolcanoes have erupted multiple times throughout human prehistory and will inevitably do so again. The sobering reality is that volcanic monitoring systems exist primarily to warn us of eruptions in regions we actively watch. Yet vast swaths of the ocean floor and remote terrestrial calderas remain poorly understood, meaning a supervolcano in an unexpected location could begin its reign of destruction before we even recognized what was happening. In that scenario, civilization would not end with a bang of public awareness and coordinated response, but rather with the creeping horror of simultaneous crop failures, mass migration, and societal collapse occurring in the confused interval between the eruption's onset and humanity's belated comprehension of what had befallen it. History offers us a grim template. The 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora killed approximately 100,000 people directly and caused global crop failures that led to the year without a summer. Yet that eruption was modest compared to what a true supervolcano would unleash, suggesting that our modern interconnected food systems and dense urban populations would amplify the catastrophe far beyond anything our ancestors endured. The uncomfortable truth is that we possess no meaningful defense against such an event, no way to prevent it, redirect it, or even significantly mitigate its consequences, leaving us dependent entirely on the statistical probability that such an Imagine waking up one morning to discover that your skin has developed the capacity to convert sunlight directly into usable energy through photosynthesis, that the very cells composing your epidermis now contain chlorophyll and the necessary organelles to transform light into glucose, which your body then metabolizes to sustain itself, meaning that spending hours in direct sunlight would gradually reduce your need for food and water. That your skin might take on a faint greenish tint depending on how active your photosynthetic processes had become, and that the more time you spent outdoors in warm climates, the less dependent you would be on traditional nutrition. The psychological mechanism behind why this scenario disturbs us so profoundly operates on multiple levels simultaneously, beginning with the fundamental violation of our categorical understanding of what it means to be human, because throughout our entire evolutionary history, we have been consumers rather than producers of organic matter. We have hunted and gathered and cultivated crops precisely because we cannot manufacture our own food from light. And this dependency has shaped not only our physiology, but our entire civilization, our social structures, our concepts of work and nourishment and survival itself all rest upon the assumption that food acquisition requires effort and exchange. When we contemplate humans gaining photosynthetic capabilities, we must confront the terrifying reorganization that would follow, imagining how profoundly our economic systems would shatter, how agricultural industries would collapse, how the very concept of labor and value would require complete reconstruction, how our relationship to sunlight itself would transform from something we passively experience to something we actively harvest, and how our cities and architectures would need to be redesigned around maximizing solar exposure rather than shelter from it. Yet there exists something even more unsettling in this thought experiment, which is how quickly we might come to accept such a transformation, how our minds possess an extraordinary capacity to normalize even the most fundamental changes to human existence. For we know from our own history that humans adapt to nearly anything given sufficient time, that what seems impossible and wrong today becomes mundane and accepted tomorrow. And we can almost picture future generations of green-skinned humans lying on sunny hillsides considering it perfectly ordinary to photosynthesize their breakfast, discussing crop rotation patterns for their own bodies, and feeling genuinely perplexed by historical texts describing their ancestors' need to cook and digest food through their stomachs. And this capacity we possess to accept radical transformation of our own nature without psychological resistance is perhaps the most uncomfortable realization of all. Because this reveals a deeper truth about human consciousness. We are not fixed entities resisting change, but infinitely malleable beings who construct our sense of normalcy around whatever conditions we find ourselves in, which means that the real horror of the photosynthetic scenario is not the transformation itself, but our recognition that we would barely notice we were becoming something entirely other. Consider the peculiar asymmetry in how we treat the space of our dreams compared to every other realm of human experience. For we spend roughly 6 years of our lives in dreams, yet we regard them as fundamentally unreal, as mere neural noise generated by a sleeping brain, and yet the emotional weight of a nightmare can follow us through an entire day of waking consciousness, the anxiety from a dream persisting in our body as surely as if we had experienced the events while awake. Which suggests that the distinction between real and unreal may be far more permeable than we typically acknowledge. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon involves the activation of the same neural networks during dreaming as during waking experience. so that when you dream of falling or of being chased, your amygdala fires with genuine fear, your heart rate increases measurably, and your body releases cortisol into your bloodstream in response to threats that exist only in the architecture of your sleeping mind, which means that from the perspective of your nervous system, the dream is entirely real. And the emotional and physiological consequences are authentic in every measurable way. We have somehow collectively agreed to dismiss the 8 hours of every night that we spend in this alternate space as simulation or illusion, yet we simultaneously grant profound significance to the psychological content of dreams, spending billions of dollars on therapy specifically designed to interpret and process dreams, consulting dream dictionaries, and attributing prophetic or psychological meaning to nocturnal visions, which creates a logical contradiction at the heart of how we conceptualize consciousness and reality. For if dreams are merely the firing of neurons and nothing more, then they should hold no more meaning than the random rustling of leaves. And yet we instinctively recognize that something important is happening in the dream space, something that matters to who we are and how we navigate existence. And this persistent contradiction remains largely unexamined in everyday discourse. As we continue to live in two radically different planes of being, granting one the designation of real and the other of unreal, while our own minds and bodies refuse to make any such distinction whatsoever. Perhaps it is time to consider that dreams are not simulations of reality, but rather a different category of reality altogether, a space where the rules of physical causation are suspended, yet the laws of consciousness operate with perfect fidelity, where meaning is generated not through external events but through the architecture of the self. And in this sense, the dream is as real as any waking experience, simply structured according to a different ontology. In this framework, the dream becomes not an escape from reality, but an exploration of it, a laboratory where the self experiments with possibility, confronts the depths of its own nature, and generates insight that waking consciousness alone cannot access, which is perhaps why the most transformative moments of human life often arrive first in dreams, waiting to be recognized and integrated into the waking world. And when we finally grant dreams the ontological status they deserve, we may discover that the boundary between sleeping and waking consciousness is not a wall but a permeable membrane through which wisdom constantly flows, if only we develop the capacity to recognize and honor what emerges from that hidden ray. Imagine waking up one morning to discover that radiation, in all its forms, had somehow become completely inert and incapable of causing any biological harm whatsoever. Alpha particles could pass through your skin without damaging a single cell, gamma rays could flood through your body without triggering any cellular mutations, and radioactive decay could continue its infinite half-lives while remaining utterly benign to all living tissue. The sun would still emit its radiation, nuclear reactors would still produce their isotopes, and your own body's natural radioactive potassium and carbon would continue their decay. But none of it would matter anymore because the fundamental physics of how radiation damages DNA and destroys cellular structures would simply cease to function. At first, this scenario seems like an unambiguous blessing, a liberation from one of nature's most persistent threats, yet the moment you contemplate its full implications, the deeply uncomfortable reality begins to emerge from beneath the surface. The first consequence would be that all the protective infrastructure humanity has built around radioactive materials would suddenly become unnecessary and obsolete, meaning that decades of careful containment protocols, lead shielding, concrete bunkers, and specialized waste disposal procedures would transform overnight into elaborate monuments to a threat that no longer exists. But far more unsettling is the recognition that radiation damage is not some random destructive force imposed upon life from the outside, but rather a fundamental mechanism through which evolution itself has operated for billions of years, shaping every organism on Earth through constant exposure to cosmic rays and naturally occurring radioactive elements in the environment. Without radiation's mutagenic effects, the very process of genetic variation that drives natural selection would be dramatically altered, meaning that life as we understand it, with all its diversity and adaptive capacity, would not exist in any recognizable form. Our own species, in particular, owes its existence to countless mutations caused by radiation exposure over millions of years, mutations that created advantageous traits and allowed our ancestors to survive and adapt to changing environments. The uncomfortable realization that settles in as you contemplate this world is that we have become so focused on radiation's dangers that we rarely acknowledge that the same force we spend enormous resources protecting ourselves against is absolutely essential to the existence of life itself, and that a world without radiation damage would be not a paradise, but rather a frozen, unchanging biological wasteland where nothing could evolve, nothing could improve, and nothing could respond to environmental pressures or threats. In such a world, even the emergence of antibiotic resistance in bacteria would cease, since radiation-induced mutations are partly responsible for generating the genetic diversity that allows microorganisms to adapt to pharmaceutical threats, meaning that without this crucial evolutionary pressure, humanity would lose one of nature's most important mechanisms for keeping pathogens in check. We would have traded the visible specter of radiation poisoning for a far more insidious catastrophe, a biosphere locked in evolutionary stasis, slowly suffocating under the weight of its own inability to change. Imagine waking up one morning to discover that water, the fundamental substance that comprises over 70% of your body and covers most of the planet's surface, has fundamentally transformed its physical properties to match those of air. The ocean would no longer be a dense, resistant medium, but rather a thin, permeable atmosphere that offers almost no resistance to movement or pressure. You could walk through the sea as easily as you walk through a room, encountering virtually no buoyancy, no drag, no weight displacement as you moved through what was once a liquid environment. Your lungs would fill with this water-air hybrid without the drowning sensation, yet the chemical properties that made water unique would remain, creating an impossible paradox where a substance maintains its molecular structure while behaving like an invisible gas. Cities built on coastlines would transform overnight, as the oceans lost their capacity to hold ships afloat or to reflect light in that characteristic azure manner. Rain would fall with the velocity and resistance of wind rather than gravity-driven droplets, and bathing would become an exercise in futility since water would simply dissipate around your skin without adhering or cleansing. The psychological mechanism underlying our discomfort with this scenario stems from our deep evolutionary reliance on water's specific physical properties. Our ancestors developed every biological system around the expectation that water would be dense, that it would support life through specific chemical interactions, and that it would provide resistance and weight. When we imagine water losing these properties, we are essentially imagining a universe where the basic parameters of existence have shifted in a way our biology cannot accommodate. We have become so accustomed to water's behavior that we never consciously acknowledge it as something contingent or changeable. Instead, we treat its properties as fundamental laws rather than emergent characteristics that depend on particular molecular arrangements and physical constants. This reveals how deeply we have normalized the specific world we inherited, never questioning whether the substances around us might arrange themselves differently, even though the universe contains infinite possibilities for alternative configurations that seem equally valid, until we remember that our existence requires precisely these conditions to persist. The comfort we derive from water's constancy is thus not a product of water's inherent superiority, but rather the accident of our evolutionary history, a reminder that we are not observers of an inevitable world, but inhabitants of one specific arrangement among countless others, clinging to its familiar properties as though they were written into the fabric of reality itself. Yet perhaps this thought experiment's deepest lesson lies not in imagining water's transformation, but in recognizing that we perform similar mental gymnastics with countless other constants in our lives. The reliable solidity of ground beneath our feet, the predictable arc of gravity, the chemical bonds that hold our bodies together, each one a contingency we've mistaken for destiny, each one a thread in the fabric of familiarity that, if pulled, would unravel our entire sense of what is possible and real. When we imagine the vacuum of space, we picture absolute nothingness, a perfect emptiness devoid of all matter and particles, yet the reality is far more unsettling and strange because space is not actually empty at all. The regions between stars and galaxies contain what physicists call the interstellar medium, a diffuse soup of gas, dust, plasma, and energy that permeates everything we observe in the cosmos. And this medium, though extraordinarily sparse by earthly standards with densities sometimes measured in mere particles per cubic centimeter, is nonetheless present and active throughout the universe. Furthermore, even in the most seemingly empty regions of space far away from any stars or galaxies, quantum mechanics tells us that virtual particles constantly pop in and out of existence due to quantum fluctuations, that the vacuum itself seethes with this quantum foam of activity, where particle-antiparticle pairs briefly materialize and annihilate in fractions of a second, meaning that absolute nothingness may be physically impossible or perhaps even meaningless as a concept. The psychological discomfort arises when we confront the implications of this reality because we have built our entire intuitive understanding of space travel and cosmic exploration upon the assumption of pure emptiness, and we have trained ourselves to think of the vacuum as the ultimate absence, a clean slate against which all other phenomena stand in relief and contrast. Our spacecraft are designed around the principle of moving through void, our equations assume near-perfect vacuums, and our metaphors use the vacuum of space as shorthand for ultimate isolation and desolation. Yet all of this mental architecture rests upon a fundamental mischaracterization of what space actually contains and what it actually is. What persists despite this scientific understanding is our linguistic and conceptual attachment to the vacuum metaphor, because it serves psychological functions that pure accuracy does not serve as well. And we continue to speak of the void of space and the emptiness of the cosmos partly because these terms communicate genuine human feelings about distance and isolation more effectively than technically precise descriptions ever could. Leaving us in a state of comfortable scientific inaccuracy where we maintain two simultaneous truths without fully reconciling them, or addressing the quiet strangeness that comes from realizing that the concept we use to describe the final frontier is fundamentally incomplete. Perhaps this is fitting, that our greatest frontier remains wrapped in a metaphor we know to be false, a linguistic shadow of the thing itself, reminding us that even as we reach toward the stars with ever greater precision and understanding, we do so still partly guided by the comforting fictions of our ancestors. The interstellar medium that fills the spaces between stars shapes how light travels across billions of years, subtly reddening distant galaxies and obscuring our view of the early universe, while the quantum foam underlying all of space may hold answers to the deepest mysteries of existence, suggesting that what we once dismissed as nothing is in fact something profoundly fundamental to reality itself. Yet even with this knowledge, we still launch our probes into what we call the void, each one a small act of faith that empty space might yield its secrets, and perhaps that paradox, reaching toward nothingness that is not nothing, is the truths. Imagine waking up tomorrow to find that the universe has begun moving backward through time in a thermodynamic sense, where broken things spontaneously reassemble themselves, where heat flows from cold objects to hot ones without any external work being applied, where a shattered glass on your kitchen floor suddenly reforms into a perfect vessel and leaps back onto the counter, where your body grows younger as each day passes and your memories become clearer instead of hazier, where the sun grows hotter and more concentrated while the universe around it mysteriously cools in a coordinated effort that defies every law of physics we have ever observed or measured. In this scenario, entropy, that fundamental measure of disorder and irreversibility that governs every natural process from the death of stars to the decay of radioactive atoms to the eventual heat death of all existence, has somehow reversed its arrow, pointing backward instead of forward through the timeline of reality. The psychological mechanism that makes this concept so profoundly unsettling operates on multiple levels simultaneously, for it challenges not merely our understanding of physics, but our most basic intuitions about causality, time, and the nature of existence itself. We live in a universe where things wear down and break apart, where energy dissipates and spreads out, where time itself seems to flow in only one direction, and this unidirectional flow is so fundamental to our experience that we have built our entire understanding of cause and effect upon it. Yet if entropy were to reverse, all of this would crumble, causality would become meaningless, and the very concept of a past distinct from a future would dissolve into philosophical nonsense. What makes this thought experiment particularly uncomfortable is that it forces us to confront how absolutely dependent we are on entropy's forward march, how it is not merely a physical law but the very foundation upon which meaning, memory, and mortality rest, and we have normalized this dependency so completely that we rarely acknowledge how strange it truly is that the universe cares so little for our comfort, our order, or our desire for permanence. If entropy reversed, death would become birth, memory would precede experience, and we would live in a world where the universe itself labors ceaselessly to undo every change, to erase every mark we make, moving inexorably toward a state of perfect, crystalline order from which nothing new could ever emerge. In such a cosmos, life itself would be impossible not because the physics would prevent it, but because the very concept of growth, learning, and becoming, the things that make existence meaningful, would be rendered paradoxical and obsolete. Yet perhaps what truly terrifies us about this reversal is not the physics itself, but the recognition that in such a world, we would have no agency, no genuine choice. Every action we take would be an illusion masking the universe's predetermined march toward absolute order, and we would be nothing more than puppets in a cosmic process of unmaking, watching helplessly as our accumulated experiences, our hard-won knowledge, and the very essence of who we are dissolves backward into the primordial simplicity from which we emerged. And in that regression toward cosmic simplicity, the very distinction between self and other would blur and fade, until consciousness itself became merely a temporary eddy in the universe's relentless current. Consider the intricate architecture of your nervous system, a vast network of billions of neurons extending throughout your body in an almost unfathomable web of connectivity. And imagine for a moment what would happen if every single one of these nerve cells fired at precisely the same instant, sending their electrical signals along their axons in perfect synchronization with all the others, creating a moment of unified neurological discharge that would ripple through your entire being in ways that our current understanding of neuroscience can barely conceptualize. In reality, your nervous system operates through an extraordinarily sophisticated system of timing and coordination where different neurons fire at different moments, creating patterns and sequences that allow your brain to process information, your muscles to move with precision, and your body to maintain homeostasis through careful regulation and feedback loops. But the unsettling question emerges when we contemplate the theoretical scenario in which this delicate temporal coordination breaks down completely, where every neuron, whether in your brain, spinal cord, or peripheral nerves, reaches its firing threshold at the identical millisecond and discharges all of its accumulated electrical potential simultaneously into the synapses and tissues connected to it. The psychological mechanism that makes this concept so deeply uncomfortable lies in our intuitive understanding that such synchronous firing would represent a total loss of neural control and differentiation, transforming your nervous system from an elegant instrument of organized biological computation into something resembling a catastrophic electrical storm. A surge of undirected neurological energy that would overwhelm every system your body depends upon for function and survival. Yet despite the apparent randomness and chaos such an event would create, there exists a strange logical basis for contemplating this scenario, because we understand that neurons do indeed fire in increasingly synchronized patterns during certain states like seizures or during anesthesia, and we recognize that the margin between order and disorder in neural function is perhaps far narrower than we would prefer to believe. The reason this thought persists despite having no practical relevance to our daily existence is perhaps because it forces us to confront the deeply unsettling realization that our sense of unified consciousness, our ability to move and think and feel, depends entirely upon the precise, almost impossibly choreographed timing of billions of independent neural events, and that the fragility underlying this system is something we have simply learned to ignore in order to function in the world. This fragility becomes even more apparent when we consider that similar synchronization events occur naturally during moments of intense fear or panic, when your amygdala floods your system with signals that momentarily override the normal hierarchical control of your prefrontal cortex, creating that overwhelming sensation of losing yourself to pure instinct. A reminder that the boundary between conscious control and neural chaos exists not as a wall, but as a permeable membrane constantly negotiated by your brain's competing demands. And perhaps this is why the image of simultaneous neural firing haunts us so persistently, because it represents not an impossible fiction, but merely an extreme manifestation of the delicate neurologica. Imagine waking tomorrow to discover that Earth's iron core, that massive sphere of solid metal suspended in a liquid outer core roughly the size of our moon, has somehow begun to cool at an accelerated rate rather than maintaining the delicate thermal equilibrium it has sustained for billions of years. This cooling would not happen gradually over millions of years as natural processes might dictate, but rather would commence immediately, tonicked, fundamentally altering the planetary mechanisms we have come to depend upon for the continuation of life itself. The inner core, currently estimated to be approximately 9,000 to 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit, would begin shedding its thermal energy into the surrounding liquid outer core, which in turn would cease generating the convective currents that produce the magnetohydrodynamic dynamo responsible for creating Earth's protective magnetic field. Within hours, the magnetic field that has shielded our planet from the relentless bombardment of solar wind and cosmic radiation for over 4 billion years would begin to weaken measurably. And within days it would collapse entirely, leaving the atmosphere exposed to particles that would gradually strip away the chemical compounds that allow us to breathe. The psychological mechanism underlying our anxiety about such a scenario stems from the recognition that we are fundamentally dependent on invisible forces operating in regions of the planet we will never visit and can barely comprehend. Yet we have built our entire technological civilization on the assumption that these forces will continue operating indefinitely without our intervention or even our attention. We have normalized our reliance on planetary systems so completely that we rarely contemplate how utterly fragile our existence truly is, how every breath we take and every magnetic moment we experience is contingent upon physical processes continuing to function in precisely the way they have for eons, despite the fact that, thermodynamically speaking, all systems tend toward disorder and cessation. And yet we proceed through our days as though the core will simply keep burning forever because it always has. The irony is that we possess the scientific knowledge to understand precisely what would happen if the core cooled, yet this understanding provides no comfort. If anything, it deepens the existential vertigo, because knowing the mechanism of potential catastrophe does not grant us the ability to prevent it, leaving us with the peculiar burden of awareness without agency, informed witnesses to our own vulnerability. This is perhaps why we construct elaborate mythologies and technological optimisms to buffer ourselves against such knowledge. We tell ourselves stories of innovation and human ingenuity, as though willpower alone could reverse the cooling of a planetary core, when in truth the only honest response to our powerlessness might be a kind of humbled acceptance that we are passengers on a vessel whose engines operate on timescales and according to principles entirely beyond our influence or comprehension. And yet in that acceptance lies a strange liberation, the recognition that our role is not to command the forces that sustain us, but merely to exist in gratitude for the incomprehensible gift of a cooling core that has not yet cooled, a magnetic field that still shelters us, another night on a planet that continues, against all odds, to spin. Consider for a moment the extraordinary precision that would emerge if every neuron in the human brain fired with absolute accuracy. If the electrical and chemical signals traversing the roughly 86 billion neurons never deviated from their intended pathway, never misfired, never sent information to the wrong destination or at the wrong moment in time. In our current reality, the brain operates as a biological system prone to occasional errors, where neurons sometimes activate inappropriately, where synaptic connections occasionally misfire due to fatigue, stress, chemical imbalances, or simple entropy, creating the foundation for human cognition as we know it. These misfires, these beautiful mistakes, are actually instrumental in how we learn, adapt, and create, because the brain's ability to modify its responses based on unexpected outcomes, to recognize patterns precisely because some signals arrive unexpectedly, allows us to develop resilience and flexibility. But imagine a world where such errors simply could not occur, where every neural signal followed its prescribed route with machine-like perfection, where the brain operated with absolute determinism, responding identically to identical stimuli every single time without variation or adaptation. What would emerge is a consciousness trapped in absolute predictability, a mind that could never truly learn because learning itself depends on the friction between expectation and outcome, between what the brain anticipated would happen and what actually did happen. Your ability to recognize your mother's face even in poor lighting, to understand speech despite accents and background noise, to navigate novel situations with creative solutions, all depend fundamentally on your brain's capacity to handle imprecision, to work with degraded or contradictory information, and to adjust its predictions when they prove wrong. Without neural misfires, without the noise and error in your neural architecture, you would become a rigid automaton, unable to generalize knowledge to new situations, unable to recover from injuries because neuroplasticity itself depends on the brain's ability to reroute signals when normal pathways are damaged. This uncomfortable paradox suggests that what we perceive as flaws in our neural machinery are actually essential features, that the imperfection of your brain is what grants you the capacity for consciousness, growth, and adaptation in an unpredictable world. Perhaps the cruelest irony is that the very neurological conditions we struggle against, ADHD, depression, anxiety, often represent not broken neurons, but neurons firing in patterns that diverge from statistical normalcy, suggesting that our definition of malfunction may itself be too narrow, too rigid to encompass the full spectrum of human cognitive possibility. A brain incapable of misfiring would be a brain incapable of genius and madness alike, stripped of the very variability that produces both the visionary and the vulnerable, leaving us with a species of perfect mediocrity, each mind an identical copy, executing the same thoughts in the same sequence, forever. In such a world, there would be no artists wrestling with their demons to create beauty, no scientists making serendipitous discoveries through experimental accident, no lovers recognizing themselves in another's imperfect gaze. Only the hollow efficiency of biological machines processing input into output with no room for the messy, magnificent. Imagine waking up one morning to discover that the very foundation of chemistry itself has fundamentally changed, that the covalent bonds holding carbon atoms together have spontaneously become unstable and fragile, breaking apart at room temperature without warning or provocation. Carbon is the element that forms the backbone of every organic molecule on Earth, the basis of all life as we understand it, and these bonds between carbon atoms are among the strongest and most reliable interactions in nature, creating the stable frameworks that allow complex molecules like proteins, DNA, and cellulose to exist and function with predictable consistency. If these bonds were to suddenly weaken or dissolve, the consequences would be almost incomprehensibly catastrophic, as every living organism would literally fall apart at the molecular level, their cellular structures collapsing into disconnected fragments as the carbon skeletons that gave them form simply ceased to hold together. The psychological mechanism that makes this scenario particularly unsettling is that we have come to treat the laws of chemistry as immutable and eternal, almost as permanent features of reality itself. And the idea that something so fundamental could simply stop working reveals a deeper uncertainty about the permanence of the physical laws we depend upon for survival. We navigate our entire existence assuming that the bonds holding our bodies together will remain stable, that the food we eat will maintain its chemical integrity long enough to nourish us, that the materials we build with will hold their structure through the passage of time, and this assumption is so deeply ingrained in our consciousness that we rarely pause to consider how fragile these arrangements truly are. Yet despite this potential for catastrophe lurking at the molecular scale, despite the logical recognition that these bonds could theoretically fail, we have normalized the stability of chemistry so completely that we never actually expect them to break, never truly fear the dissolution of carbon bonds the way we might fear other disasters. And this gap between what we logically understand as possible and what we actually expect to happen creates a peculiar kind of psychological distance from an otherwise genuinely terrifying prospect. Perhaps this psychological distance exists precisely because carbon bond stability has never failed us in recorded history, making it easier to regard such a scenario as pure abstraction rather than genuine threat, a theoretical catastrophe that belongs to the realm of imagination rather than to the domain of real-world anxiety that shapes our daily lives and decisions. Yet this comfortable separation between theoretical possibility and lived experience would shatter instantly if carbon bonds ever did begin to fail, transforming chemistry from an invisible guarantee of existence into an active, visible threat. And in that moment of transition from assumption to reality, the psychological distance we have carefully maintained would collapse entirely, leaving us face to face with a fundamental uncertainty we had never truly prepared ourselves to confront. In that moment, we would finally understand that the permanence we attributed to chemistry was never an inherent property of the universe itself, but merely a consistent pattern we had observed and come to depend upon, and the sudden breaking of that pattern would force us to confront the sobering reality that even in the current understanding of thermodynamics and cosmology, the universe is moving toward a state of maximum entropy, a condition known as heat death, where all energy becomes uniformly distributed and no work can be performed. Yet there exists a deeply unsettling possibility that this inevitable end state might not arrive on the timeline we have calculated, but rather accelerates toward us at an increasing rate. fundamentally altering our perception of time remaining and the nature of cosmic destiny itself. The real-life situation involves recognizing that while the second law of thermodynamics tells us entropy always increases in a closed system, several theoretical frameworks suggest that the rate of this entropic increase might not remain constant, but could instead follow an accelerating curve, much like the expansion of the universe itself, which we now know is accelerating rather than slowing as physicists once believed, and if heat death were similarly accelerating. The timeline for the universe's final equilibrium could compress dramatically from the currently estimated Google years into something far more immediate on a cosmic scale. The psychological mechanism that makes this concept particularly unsettling operates on multiple levels simultaneously, beginning with the way our minds struggle to comprehend incomprehensibly large timeframes, and then suddenly confronting the notion that even those timeframes might be compressed further by an unknown factor we cannot predict or measure, creating a recursive uncertainty where the very foundation of our temporal assumptions becomes questionable. And this uncertainty persists because we lack observational data spanning the billions of years necessary to measure whether entropy acceleration is actually occurring, leaving us in the uncomfortable position of understanding the mathematics while remaining fundamentally ignorant about its real-world application. What makes this particular cosmic scenario psychologically destabilizing is how it combines two different categories of human anxiety: the pre-existing dread of eventual universal death, and the newer, more acute anxiety of being wrong about the timeline by orders of magnitude. And despite the absence of compelling evidence that heat death is actually accelerating, despite the fact that our best current models suggest a relatively stable rate of entropy increase, the possibility remains intellectually valid enough that we cannot dismiss it entirely. Which means we live with this unresolved uncertainty as a permanent feature of our understanding of reality, neither confirmed nor refuted, but simply hovering at the edge of our knowledge like a question we are not yet equipped to answer. And perhaps this is where the true horror lies, not in heat death itself, but in the recognition that we have constructed our entire philosophical framework around assumptions of stability and predictability, only to discover that the universe may operate according to rules far more chaotic than our models suggest, leaving us to contemplate whether our ignorance of cosmic acceleration is itself a form of blindness we cannot overcome. This blindness extends to our daily lives, where we construct meaning and plan futures as though time operates on predictable scales, yet simultaneously harbor the knowledge that our cosmic chronometer might be fundamentally miscalibrated, forcing us to exist in the strange liminal space between rational action and cosmic unsee. Imagine waking up one morning to discover that the very organelles responsible for powering every cell in your body have fundamentally changed their relationship with you, transforming from essential partners into energy-stealing parasites that gradually drain your vitality while offering nothing in return. In this scenario, mitochondria would begin prioritizing their own replication and survival over the cellular functions they evolved to support, slowly diverting ATP energy away from your neurons, muscles, and organs to fuel their own exponential multiplication within each cell. The process would be insidious and nearly imperceptible at first, manifesting as a creeping exhaustion that no amount of sleep or nutrition could remedy, a fatigue so profound that even the simplest activities would feel impossibly difficult. Your cells, once bustling metropolitan centers of coordinated activity, would transform into battlegrounds where mitochondria extracted metabolic resources like landlords squeezing tenants, leaving your tissues weakened and dysfunctional while the parasitic organelles grew ever more numerous. The tragedy of this scenario lies in the historical irony that mitochondria were themselves once free-living bacteria that entered into symbiosis with our ancient ancestors billions of years ago. And this thought experiment asks us to contemplate the terrifying possibility that such symbiotic relationships are inherently unstable, that cooperation between organisms at different scales might inevitably degrade into exploitation given enough evolutionary time. We accept the mitochondrial partnership as an absolute foundation of life itself, rarely questioning whether the terms of this ancient cellular contract remain mutually beneficial, never truly knowing if the boundary between symbiosis and parasitism has already begun to blur in ways our medical science cannot yet detect. And we continue living our daily lives with implicit trust in biological systems that could theoretically turn against us at any moment. Perhaps this is why certain degenerative diseases, mitochondrial myopathies, progressive neurological disorders, unexplained chronic fatigue syndromes, remain so mysterious and resistant to treatment. We have been searching for external pathogens and genetic mutations when the true enemy has been quietly multiplying within us all along, a slow-motion betrayal written into the very architecture of our cells. In such a world, we might finally understand why evolution has equipped us with redundancy. Multiple mitochondria per cell, cellular autophagy mechanisms designed to eliminate dysfunctional organelles, as nature's own insurance policy against the possibility that our most ancient partners could one day become our most intimate enemies. And we would realize that our bodies have always harbored contingency plans for a betrayal we never consciously feared. Yet even with these cellular safeguards in place, we would face a sobering truth, that the very mechanisms designed to protect us might themselves become overwhelmed, unable to contain a parasitic transformation occurring across trillions of cells simultaneously, leaving us helpless witnesses to our own metabolic collapse, trapped in bodies that are literally consuming themselves from within. Consider for a moment the fundamental machinery of life itself, the intricate three-dimensional structures that proteins must assume to perform their vital functions within your cells. And then imagine a reality where every single one of these delicate geometric configurations assembles itself incorrectly, consistently, and without exception. In our actual world, proteins are synthesized from long chains of amino acids that twist and fold into specific shapes determined by chemical bonds and electromagnetic forces, and these shapes are absolutely critical to their function, whether they need to transport oxygen, catalyze reactions, or defend against pathogens. The process of protein folding is guided by thermodynamic principles, governed by entropy and energy minimization, and under normal circumstances, proteins manage to achieve their correct three-dimensional configuration through what we might call biological trial and error, folding and unfolding until they settle into their lowest energy state. But in this uncomfortable hypothetical scenario, imagine if the fundamental laws of physics governing these interactions were slightly different, if the electromagnetic attractions and repulsions between atoms were inverted, or if hydrophobic and hydrophilic forces worked in reverse, causing every protein to misfold consistently into non-functional configurations the moment it was created. This would mean that the precise mechanism that billions of years of evolution refined so carefully, the elegant system that allows information encoded in DNA to become functional three-dimensional machines, would be broken at its foundation, rendering all life impossible in any recognizable form. The reason this scenario unsettles us is that it exposes how utterly dependent we are on the stability of physical law at scales we cannot observe, on forces and principles that simply must work exactly as they do for our existence to be possible at all. We tend to accept protein folding as a given, as part of the background machinery of being alive, never truly contemplating that if the rules were even marginally different, this entire elaborate system would collapse into chaos and dysfunction. There is something deeply discomforting about realizing that the existence of functional proteins is not actually a triumph of biological engineering, but rather a lucky consequence of physical laws that happen to arrange themselves in exactly the configuration required for chemistry to work, for life to begin, and for consciousness to eventually emerge from the dust of stars and the dance of atoms. Yet perhaps the most unsettling aspect is that this scenario is not entirely fictional. Misfolded proteins do occur in our world, accumulating in neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, suggesting that even our current reality contains whispers of this darker possibility, where the margin between order and catastrophe is far narrower than we might wish to believe. When we observe prion diseases, where a single misfolded protein can act like a corrupting agent, transforming properly folded proteins into copies of itself, we glimpse what a world of universal misfolding might actually look like. A cascade of dysfunction spreading inexorably through biological systems until nothing works anymore, until the very chemistry of life becomes a self-perpetuating nightmare of malformation and decay. Consider the possibility that consciousness is not some rare and precious phenomenon confined to brains and neural networks, but rather a fundamental property distributed throughout the living world at every scale, meaning that the trillions of cells comprising your body might each possess their own form of awareness, sensation, and perhaps even primitive intention. Your skin cells, your liver cells, your immune cells, the neurons in your gut that communicate with your brain through chemical signals. Each one of these microscopic entities could theoretically be experiencing something analogous to consciousness, some minimal form of subjective awareness or sensation that we simply lack the framework to recognize or measure. The mechanisms supporting this uncomfortable possibility emerge when we examine cellular behavior more closely, observing that individual cells respond to their environment with remarkable sophistication. They communicate with neighboring cells through complex chemical languages. They make decisions about whether to divide or die. They remember previous encounters with harmful substances, and they demonstrate preference patterns that suggest something more than mere mechanical reaction. When a single-celled organism like an amoeba navigates toward food and away from toxins, we might dismiss this as instinct. Yet the complexity of its decision-making processes and its apparent goal-directedness suggest possibilities that challenge our easy categorization of consciousness as uniquely human or even uniquely neural. The deeply uncomfortable aspect of this proposition is that we have normalized our dismissal of cellular experience without ever truly proving its absence. We have simply assumed that consciousness requires a certain organizational threshold, a minimum complexity level that single cells or simple tissues cannot possibly reach. And yet this assumption may reflect our own cognitive biases and limitations rather than any fundamental truth about the nature of awareness itself. We move through our days completely indifferent to the possibility that we are walking confederations of countless conscious entities, each making its own micro-decisions, each responding to stimuli within its small world, and we find this thought so cognitively distant from our daily experience that we file it away as philosophical speculation rather than genuine possibility. Yet if we allowed ourselves to seriously entertain this possibility, even provisionally, it would fundamentally reframe our understanding of pain, healing, disease, and the body's mysterious capacity to regulate itself, suggesting that illness might represent not merely cellular malfunction, but a form of widespread cellular distress, and that recovery could be understood as a restoration of harmony among billions of conscious agents working toward collective survival. This reframing might explain why practices like meditation, breathwork, and compassionate attention seem to facilitate healing, not through some mystical mechanism, but because sustained awareness and intentional presence create the conditions for these billions of cellular consciousnesses to coordinate more effectively, to listen to one another across the vast chemical networks that bind them together into the unified experience we call self. Imagine waking to discover that the strong nuclear force, that fundamental interaction holding protons and neutrons together at the heart of every atom, has inexplicably diminished by even the smallest fraction. This isn't a dramatic collapse into chaos, but rather a subtle weakening, perhaps a reduction of just 1% in its strength relative to the other fundamental forces governing our universe. The immediate consequences would unfold with a terrible inevitability that most people would never consciously recognize until it was far too late. Atomic nuclei across the cosmos would become marginally less stable, their binding energy slightly reduced, meaning that isotopes we consider stable would begin undergoing radioactive decay at accelerated rates. Elements like carbon-12, the very foundation of organic chemistry and all carbon-based life, would become gradually less stable, developing slight radioactive properties that would introduce constant background radiation into every living cell on Earth. The psychological mechanism that makes this scenario so disquieting is our fundamental reliance on the permanence of matter itself. We have built our entire understanding of chemistry, biology, and medicine on the assumption that certain elements remain reliably stable across human timescales. The thought that this stability could erode creates a creeping sense of betrayal by the universe itself, as if the ground rules of existence are being silently rewritten without consultation. We have normalized the idea of nuclear stability so completely that we rarely acknowledge how extraordinary it truly is, how improbable that the delicate balance of forces in nature has conspired to create a universe where complexity can persist. Yet this normalization persists despite its fundamental arbitrariness, despite the fact that we cannot fully explain why the strong force has precisely the strength it does. If the strong force were even marginally weaker, the universe as we know it would never have formed at all, no stars would have ignited, no heavy elements would exist, and the very possibility of this moment of realization would have been erased before it could begin. We are, in essence, contemplating the unraveling of the improbable miracle that permits us to exist at all. And yet, paradoxically, this scenario forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that our existence has always been contingent upon forces we neither chose nor control, operating at scales so remote from human experience that we can scarcely comprehend them. In weakening the nuclear force by even 1%, we would simply be making visible the fragility that has always lurked beneath the surface of reality. Every technology we have built, every medicine we have synthesized, every structure we have engineered, all of it rests upon atomic bonds that would now be quietly dissolving at the quantum level, a silent undermining of the material world that preceded our awareness of it by years or perhaps decades. By the time we detected the first anomalies, a slight increase in background radiation, unexpected decay in supposedly stable isotopes, the gradual dimming of stellar cores as fusion became marginally less efficient. The weakening would already be woven into the fabric of every living system, a fundamental remaking of biology that we could observe but never truly reverse. Consider for a moment the fundamental understanding that has anchored modern physics for over a century. Photons, those elementary particles of light that stream endlessly from the sun and fill the universe with electromagnetic radiation, are massless entities that travel at the speed of light precisely because they possess no rest mass whatsoever. This is not merely an arbitrary classification, but rather the cornerstone of relativity theory, the foundation upon which our entire comprehension of energy, light, and the structure of spacetime itself has been constructed. Now imagine if this were not the case, if photons possessed even the tiniest amount of mass, some infinitesimal fraction of an electron's weight, and consider how thoroughly this single modification would unravel the tapestry of physics as we understand it. Light would no longer travel at 300,000 kilometers per second without exception. Instead, it would move slightly slower depending on its frequency and energy, creating a universe where the constancy of light's speed becomes merely an approximation rather than an immutable law. The implications cascade outward in waves of increasing strangeness. Gravity would operate differently across cosmic scales, as the mass of photons would contribute to gravitational fields in ways we have never measured, potentially explaining or demolishing our theories about dark matter and the expansion of the universe. The very nature of vision would transform, as the photons reaching your eyes would carry weight and momentum in ways that would subtly alter how images form on your retinas. Stars would burn differently, their energy output accounting for the mass loss of emitted photons at rates that would fundamentally change stellar evolution and the timescales upon which galaxies themselves could form and die. Yet what makes this scenario particularly unsettling is how such a premise would persist within physics not as a contradiction, but as an accepted fact that we would simply incorporate into our models and equations, adjusting our theories and observations to accommodate this new reality, much as we have done countless times throughout the history of science when our understanding of the universe required revision. Indeed, we might never even recognize such a universe as fundamentally altered, for our instruments would be calibrated to this new reality from the moment of their creation, and our theories would seem as elegant and complete as our current models do now, leaving us forever blind to the profound difference between what is and what we have always assumed must be. This is perhaps the deepest danger of any scientific paradigm, not that it might be wrong, but that it could be wrong in ways so fundamental and pervasive that the wrongness becomes invisible, woven into the very fabric of how we observe and interpret reality itself, making the false indistinguishable from the true until some future civilization, looking back at our confident proclamations, recognizes in them the unmistakable marks of our particular blindness. And yet, even as we acknowledge this possibility, we might take some comfort in the fact that our current measurements have constrained any photon mass to extraordinarily tiny limits, less than a trillionth of an electron's mass, suggesting that if this particular blindness afflicts us, at least its consequences remain mercifully subtle, hidden beneath the precision of instruments designed to detect exactly. Consider for a moment the reality of mutations as they actually exist in nature, where the vast majority of genetic changes that occur during DNA replication are either neutral or harmful to the organism carrying them, with only a small fraction conferring any kind of advantage that natural selection might favor and perpetuate through populations over generations. Cancer cells mutate constantly, acquiring new genetic variations that allow them to evade the immune system and spread more aggressively through tissues, yet we would never describe these as beneficial to the organism as a whole. Cystic fibrosis, sickle cell anemia, hemophilia, and thousands of other genetic diseases arise from mutations that cause tremendous suffering and early death, representing the actual mechanism by which most random genetic changes manifest in living things. Now imagine instead a world where every single mutation that occurred, every random change to every gene in every living organism, somehow produced an improvement to that organism's fitness or function, where there existed no such thing as a harmful or even neutral genetic variation. In this scenario, evolution would operate on an entirely different principle, one where the randomness of genetic change would become irrelevant because every possibility would be advantageous, creating a kind of perpetual optimization where organisms would improve with each generation in ways we can scarcely conceptualize. The mechanism underlying our real world involves the brutal reality that random changes are statistically more likely to break something than to improve it. Much like randomly modifying the code of a complex computer program is far more likely to introduce errors than to enhance functionality. This deeply uncomfortable truth has become so normalized in biological thinking that we rarely pause to consider how strange it actually is that life has managed to thrive despite this tremendous disadvantage. That natural selection has somehow managed to refine and improve organisms through the patient sorting of rare beneficial changes from mountains of useless or destructive ones. The psychology of accepting this reality involves a kind of resigned pragmatism, a recognition that complexity itself creates vulnerability, that the more intricate a system becomes, the more ways there are for random perturbations to cause damage rather than improvement. This perspective persists despite our intuitive desire for a universe that operates more cleanly and efficiently, where randomness would at least have the decency to be neutral or helpful. Yet we continue to study and accept genetic reality precisely because the evidence overwhelmingly demonstrates that beneficial mutations are the exceptional outcome rather than the rule. The fossil record and comparative genomics further underscore this point, revealing that organisms have accumulated beneficial mutations at a measurable rate that allows us to trace evolutionary divergence and estimate when species last shared common ancestors, a methodology that would be entirely meaningless in a world where every mutation conferred advantage and sorting between them became impossible. Understanding this distinction between the theoretical world of universal benefit and the actual world of rare advantage amid overwhelming noise becomes essential for comprehending not just evolution itself, but the fundamental relationship between randomness and order in biological systems. Imagine if, in our planet's distant past, a second celestial body had remained in stable orbit around Earth, creating a binary moon system where two distinct spheres hung in our night sky, each exerting its own gravitational pull on our world and casting dual shadows across the landscape during certain celestial alignments. The reality of our current single moon already profoundly shapes nearly every aspect of life on this planet, from the rhythmic tides that surge across our oceans twice daily to the stabilization of Earth's axial tilt that has permitted the emergence and persistence of complex life forms. Yet the introduction of a second moon would have cascaded into consequences so dramatically different that the very existence of humanity, as we know it, would have become virtually impossible. The tidal forces generated by two moons would have created far more chaotic and violent oceanic movements, with competing gravitational influences creating interference patterns that would have made the early oceans an unpredictable tempest of surging waters, potentially disrupting the delicate chemical processes necessary for the emergence of life itself, and even if life had somehow managed to develop in such conditions. The constant turbulence would have prevented the stable shallow seas and protected nurseries where early organisms flourished. Furthermore, the gravitational dynamics of a two-moon system would have rendered Earth's axial tilt unstable and subject to wild, chaotic variations across vast timescales, meaning that instead of the relatively consistent seasonal patterns that have allowed life to develop predictable biological rhythms and evolutionary strategies, our planet would have experienced periods of extreme axial tilt that would have sent entire hemispheres into permanent darkness or subjected them to constant, unbearable heat, effectively preventing any stable biosphere from developing at all. The night sky itself would have been transformed into something almost alien, with the two moons potentially blocking out the stars during certain phases or creating complex shadow patterns on the ground that would have made early human navigation and astronomical understanding of the cosmos fundamentally different, altering the entire trajectory of how our species understood our place in the universe. Yet despite how profoundly and obviously impossible human existence would be under such conditions, we find ourselves oddly drawn to imagining such scenarios, perhaps because they reveal how extraordinarily fortunate we are to exist at all within this narrow band of cosmic possibilities. In science fiction and popular culture, the two-moon scenario has become a recurring motif, appearing in countless novels, films, and artistic imaginings, suggesting that humanity's fascination with this impossible alternate Earth stems from a deep, almost instinctive recognition that our existence represents not inevitability, but rather an improbable gift. A reminder that the universe's capacity to generate conscious beings capable of wondering about their own origins depends fundamentally on configurations so specific and delicate that even minor variations would render such wonder permanently impossible. This cosmic perspective invites us to contemplate not merely the mechanics of orbital dynamics or tidal physics, but rather the profound philosophical implications of inhabiting a universe where the conditions necessary for consciousness to emerge and reflect. Imagine waking one morning to discover that your skin has begun to emit a soft, ethereal glow during the night hours, a phenomenon that spreads silently across the human population like a benign contagion, transforming our species into creatures of living light. The mechanism behind this unsettling scenario emerges from the intersection of viral adaptation and genetic integration, wherein a modified bioluminescent gene from certain deep-sea organisms or fungi somehow enters the human genome through exposure, mutation, or deliberate genetic modification, beginning to express itself in our skin cells and tissues. At first, the glow might appear only in small patches during darkness, a gentle blue-green luminescence that intensifies with metabolic activity and emotional arousal, causing human faces to brighten noticeably during moments of stress, excitement, or anxiety. The spread would likely follow social and environmental patterns, beginning in coastal populations or those with frequent contact with marine environments, then propagating outward through generations as the trait becomes increasingly common, perhaps even advantageous in certain social contexts where visibility and nonverbal communication take on new dimensions. What becomes psychologically fascinating is how quickly humanity would rationalize and normalize this radical transformation of our fundamental biology, finding aesthetic appeal in the glow, developing fashion around the intensity of our personal luminescence, and creating social hierarchies based on the brightness and color variations of our bioluminescent emissions. We would begin to view the loss of darkness not as a violation of our evolutionary heritage, but as progress, decorating ourselves further with reflective materials and bioluminescent tattoos to amplify our natural glow, until the very concept of humans existing in complete biological darkness seemed primitive and quaint. Children born into this glowing world would know nothing else, accepting the perpetual faint light emanating from every sleeping human body as completely natural, and the psychological discomfort of the original generations would fade into history, becoming merely another adjustment in the long succession of changes that have reshaped what we consider normal about the human experience, leaving us to wonder what other transformations we might accept given enough time and generational distance. Perhaps the most unsettling consequence would be the loss of privacy itself, the inability to hide our presence in darkness, to move unobserved through the night, to maintain the ancient human refuge of shadow and concealment that has shaped our psychology since before we learned to make fire. Our nocturnal world, once a domain of mystery and solitude, would become a landscape of unavoidable visibility, forcing us to confront not just what we look like when illuminated, but who we fundamentally are when we can no longer choose to disappear. We might find ourselves redesigning our entire built environment around this perpetual luminescence, dimming our artificial lights, embracing darker architecture, creating sanctuaries of absolute darkness as luxury commodities for those wealthy enough to afford true night, until the ability to experience genuine darkness becomes the ultimate status symbol, a privilege reserved for the few who can pay to temporarily escape the biological visibility that has become inescapable for everyone else. Imagine waking up one morning to discover that calcium, one of the most fundamental elements in the biological world, has simply ceased to exist. This mineral, which comprises approximately 2% of your body weight, would vanish entirely from every organism on Earth, and the consequences would unfold with a kind of terrible inevitability that most people fail to comprehend until they truly sit with the concept. Calcium is not merely a structural component. It is the architectural foundation upon which life itself has been built for hundreds of millions of years, woven so thoroughly into the fabric of existence that removing it would be like removing gravity from physics. Your skeleton, composed of roughly 1 kilogram of calcium in an adult human body, would begin to demineralize within hours, becoming soft and pliable like cartilage, gradually collapsing under even the gentlest pressure. But the skeletal catastrophe would be merely the opening movement in a symphony of failure. Calcium ions serve as critical messengers in every cell of your body, triggering muscle contractions, regulating heartbeat, enabling nerve impulses to travel from your brain to your fingertips, and orchestrating the release of neurotransmitters that allow thoughts to form and memories to persist. The moment calcium vanished, your heart would lose its ability to contract in any coordinated fashion, your neurons would fall silent, your muscles would become unresponsive to conscious command, and your neurons would cease firing entirely. Every organism with a skeleton would suffer the same fate, which means that within days, all vertebrate life on Earth would be essentially extinct. The ocean ecosystems, built upon the shells and skeletons of countless creatures that require calcium for their very construction, would collapse into chaos as corals dissolved, mollusks lost their protective structures, and crustaceans simply ceased to function. The plants would also suffer profoundly, as calcium plays an essential role in cell wall formation and growth regulation, meaning that photosynthesis would become impossible and the entire foundation of terrestrial nutrition would crumble. What makes this particular catastrophe so unsettling to contemplate is not merely the scale of destruction, but the absolute completeness of the biological failure it would represent, revealing how utterly dependent every form of life has become on this single element, and how fragile the entire web of existence truly is when you remove even one seemingly replaceable piece. In a matter of weeks, the bacterial and fungal kingdoms would follow their larger cousins into extinction, as even the most primitive organisms depend on calcium for cellular regulation and structural integrity, leaving behind a sterile planet where the only remaining life would be the simplest viruses and RNA molecules, drifting through an ocean of chemical ruin, a grim reminder that complexity in biology is not a luxury, but a consequence of calcium's elegant necessity. The irony is that calcium, which took billions of years to accumulate in the Earth's crust through geological processes, would have its biological legacy erased in mere weeks, a sobering testament to how quickly the edifice of life collapses when its foundational elements are removed, and how the planet itself would revert to a state of chemical simplicity not seen since before the first organisms learned to build their bodies from minerals and bone. Imagine waking one morning to discover that the fundamental process binding together the very atoms of reality has simply ceased to function, that radioactive decay, the spontaneous transformation of unstable atomic nuclei into more stable forms, has stopped occurring anywhere in the universe. This is not a gradual slowing or weakening of the process, but rather an instantaneous halting, as though nature herself has flipped a cosmic switch and decided that the decay constant that has governed atomic instability for billions of years no longer applies. In the first moments, nothing would seem amiss, because most of the decay happening around us occurs in contexts we cannot directly perceive, yet within hours the implications would cascade through every system that depends upon this fundamental process. Medical imaging facilities would find their radioactive isotopes frozen in their original forms, unable to emit the radiation that allows us to peer inside human bodies and detect disease. Power plants relying on nuclear fission would experience catastrophic failures, as the decay process that generates heat through atomic splitting simply would not occur anymore. The Earth's internal heat, much of which derives from radioactive decay of uranium and thorium deep within the planet's core, would begin to cool, a process that would unfold over geological timescales, yet would fundamentally alter our planet's ability to maintain its magnetic field and sustain the tectonic activity that shapes our continents. The psychological mechanism at work here involves our deep dependence on processes we have learned to harness and control, yet simultaneously reveals how little we truly understand about the universe's most basic operations. We have built entire medical technologies and energy infrastructure around radioactive decay without truly comprehending why the universe permits this transformation to occur at all. And when we contemplate its sudden cessation, we are forced to confront the arbitrary nature of the physical laws we take for granted. What is perhaps most unsettling is how this scenario forces us to recognize that the very stability of matter itself, the reason atoms exist in their current configurations at all, depends upon processes that can be described mathematically but never truly explained in any deeper sense, and that our civilization's technological progress rests upon natural phenomena we merely observe and measure rather than truly understand or control. The sobering truth is that radioactive decay has been occurring since the universe's inception, woven so thoroughly into the fabric of existence that its absence would reveal how much of what we call natural law is simply the way things happen to be rather than the way they must be, leaving us to wonder whether other equally fundamental processes might someday simply cease without warning or explanation. The uranium that has warmed our planet for 4.5 billion years would become inert matter, and we would be left to contemplate a universe where even the most seemingly permanent features of reality, the slow radioactive heartbeat that sustains geothermal energy, that powers the sun's distant cousin in Earth's core, could vanish in an instant, leaving us adrift in a cosmos far more fragile and contingent than our science had dared to suggest. Imagine waking one morning to discover that the fundamental constant governing the quantum realm has shifted ever so subtly, a change so infinitesimal that no single measurement could detect it in isolation, yet one that compounds across every quantum interaction occurring throughout the universe at this very moment. The Planck constant, denoted by the symbol h, represents the smallest unit of action in nature, the bridge between the quantum and classical worlds, and it forms the foundation of nearly every equation in quantum mechanics, from Heisenberg's uncertainty principle to the energy of photons themselves. If this constant were to decrease by even 1 part in a billion, the entire structure of atoms would begin to shift almost imperceptibly. Electron orbits would subtly expand or contract. The colors of light emitted by stars would gradually drift across the spectrum, and the very stability of matter as we understand it would enter a slow, inexorable transformation. The psychological mechanism that makes this scenario so deeply unsettling rests in our dependence on constants as the ultimate anchors of reality, the unchanging reference points by which we measure and predict everything else in existence. We have built our entire civilization, our technology, our medicines, our understanding of chemistry and physics upon the assumption that these fundamental values remain eternally fixed, that they are as permanent as the laws of nature themselves. Yet the Planck constant is merely a number, discovered through observation and measurement rather than derived from any deeper principle, and the disturbing truth that quietly underlies modern physics is that we do not truly understand why this constant has the value it does, nor can we prove with absolute certainty that it has never changed. We have normalized the idea that fundamental constants are immutable because the alternative requires us to confront the unsettling possibility that the very foundation of physical law might be more fragile and mutable than we care to admit, that somewhere in the universe's deep history, constants may have drifted and shifted, and that the universe we observe might be simply one particular configuration among infinite possibilities. If the Planck constant had shifted even slightly during the early moments after the Big Bang, the quantum foam from which all matter and energy condensed would have crystallized into a universe fundamentally alien to our own, perhaps one where atoms never formed, where chemistry never emerged, where consciousness itself became impossible. We exist in a universe with this particular Planck constant not because it was chosen or optimized, but simply because we could not exist to ask the question in any other. This is the anthropic principle in its most humbling form. We are not observers of a specially calibrated universe, but rather conscious beings who could only emerge within the infinitesimal band of physical parameters where observers are possible, forever unable to know what lies beyond our cosmic boundary conditions. The shift in the Planck constant, should it occur at all, would move us imperceptibly closer to that boundary, each quantum interaction a tiny step toward a universe where the mathematics of existence no longer permits the chemistry of life.